Hello and good evening. Tonight's gentle journey takes us to the great Maya collapse. What really happened to the silent cities? Lower the volume, rest your eyes, and let the past be your lullaby. If this brings you peace, consider liking and subscribing only if it truly helps. And share in the comments where you're joining us from. And the hour there, now. Lights down, a soft fan if you have one, and let's begin our walk through history. Deep in the rainforests of Central America, there are silent cities. Stone pyramids rise above the canopy like islands at high tide. Plazas and palaces sleep under lattices of roots and the slow weight of leaves. For generations, these places were known best to the people who lived around them, who worked, prayed, and told us stories with insight of their sleeping stone ancestors. To outsiders, they were rumors a toppled idol in a clearing, a wall glimpsed through vines, the suggestion of a staircase swallowed by earth. Yet these cities were once the beating heart of a world, the classic Maya world, that shone with intelligence, order, and dazzling artistry. The ancient Maya achieved a rare trinity. They developed the only fully fledged writing system in the pre-Columbian Americas, devised calendars of extraordinary precision, and read the sky with a patience and accuracy that still surprises modern astronomers. They were sculptors of time and a stone, readers of planets, builders who set mountains of masonry atop platforms of exact mathematics. Their kings called themselves holy lords. Their rituals were severe and beautiful, and their art could be delicate as a feather or stark as an eclipse. And then, in the southern lowlands, the cities quieted, not in a single heartbeat, not in a wave of flame and conquest, but in a long, unspooling monuments ceased to speak. Great avenues emptied, and the jungle, tireless and unjudging, began to take the places back. Why? That is the riddle that has pulled travelers and scholars across swamps and through heat that shimmers like glass. Tonight, we will walk the arc of that story with care. We will visit the high season of the classic Maya, when kings counted the days in cords of numbers and the stonemasons lifted entire histories into place. Then, like patient archaeologists, we will kneel beside the clues carved dates that suddenly stop, murals that turn from ceremony to chaos, lake beds that hold the memory of drought in their pale layers, hills that shed soil after too many trees were felled, and we will consider how these pieces fit. There will be no single cause, no villain in a mask, but a braided crisis, endemic warfare slipping its leash, environmental strain deepening into damage, and above it all, a sky that withheld the simple mercy of rain. For a moment, before we begin to disentangle the evidences, let the night deepen around us the way the jungle deepens around a temple at dusk. In the quiet, you can almost hear the last market stalls closing, the thud of a pestle in a maize mortar, the faint clatter from a stair where a priest's sandals have just passed. Fireflies stitch drifting lines of green light over a ball court chalked with dust. A howler monkey announces its small ferocity to a place that has known empires. The air smells of damp stone, incense long faded, and the green bite of crushed leaves. When we speak of collapse, let it not be a thunderclap in your mind. Think, rather, of a tide turning slow, then sudden, then slow again until one day the water that always came simply fails to arrive. The first thing to remember, gentle and important, is that the Maya never vanished. Today, millions of Maya people live across Mexico, Guatemala, Belize, Honduras, and El Salvador. They speak living Mayan languages, weave patterns whose meanings run older than paper, plant milpa fields in cycles that outlast headlines, and mark sacred days on calendars that still hold the old logic. What ended in the southern lowlands between roughly 750 and 900 CE was not a people, but a political and urban order, a way of organizing faith, power, and a stone. When we say silent cities, we mean plazas that lost their crowds and kings who lost their words, not a culture erased. Keep that distinction close. It will steady everything that follows. To set our course, think of two kinds of time the Maya knew well. There is the sacred time of cycles, where days interlock like gears, the 260-day round that measures destiny and ceremony, the 365-day round that steers sowing and harvest, the 52-year embrace when the two meet again, and there is history's time, counted long and straight by the long count, from a mythic dawn in 31 or 14 BCE. The Maya carved that count into stone so precisely that we can pinpoint events to the day. It is this exactness that lets us watch the unraveling in something like real time. We don't have to guess at centuries. We can see the very dates where the voices go quiet. That silence in the record is not merely absence, it is evidence. Before the silence, there was noise, a beautiful, organized noise. Courts where scribes smoothed bark paper and drew glyphs like small, self-contained worlds, observatories where priest astronomers, staring past torches into the cold work of Venus, updated tables that kept festivals tethered to the sky, workshops where jade was drilled bead by bead with a patient grit that outlasted hours. There were markets breathing in and out with salt and obsidian, cacao and bright shell, causeways that tied one neighborhood to another the way sentences tie thought to thought, reservoirs with stone lips that held rain like a promise. In the rituals that anchored it all, the ruler stood as a hinge between the human and the more than human, cutting his own skin with obsidian, offering blood as speech, calling ancestors and gods through the smoke to bless the order that fed the fields and steadied the sun. Such things do not end for one reason any more than a forest dies from a single beetle. What we will find as we move is a sequence and a layering. First, the wars that had long been ritual and reputation begin to feel different, less about captured lords as trophies in sacred theater, more about strongholds and sieges, more about fear. Then, the costs at the edges of ambition rise, trees fall faster than they return, hills shiver their soil into rivers. The brilliant white skin of plastered buildings demands fuel that grows scarce. At last, the sky changes its mind. The rains miss their cue not once, but season after season, and a city built to drink on time begins to thirst in earnest. In that thirst, old promises falter, the king bleeds, the incense coils and fades, and the clouds refuse to be persuaded. We will go slowly. We will begin with the moment the outside world finally looked the Maya in the face and recognized what had been there all along, a civilization indigenous to the Americas, as intricate in its thought and art as any on earth. We will travel with two men who hacked their way through heat and rumor to a riverside city, stone cool in the shade, and saw in its carvings not a lost tribe from elsewhere, but a voice from here. We will watch how their drawings traveled faster than their feet could, persuading readers who would never feel a tropical afternoon that the silent cities were real and, more importantly, were local in their genius. We will stand again in plazas at Palenque and Tikal as morning lifts the mist, and we will allow ourselves the soft astonishment that always belongs to first sight, and then, with the picture framed, we will begin to read. We will read the monuments as records names, births, accessions, victories, deaths. We will read the ground fortification ditches where there should have been gardens, half-laid pavements leading nowhere. We will read the mud at lake bottoms, pollen and minerals layered like pages in a book that cares nothing for kings. We will read stalagmites that grew one raindrop at a time in caves all those centuries, recording wet and dry with the patience of stone. We will read, too, what is not there, stelae undated, workshops empty, hearths in palace rooms, where commoners squatted briefly before moving on. The city speaks, both in what it says and what it fails at last to say. Tonight's journey is meant to be a steady. Let it slow your breath. The jungle around these cities is not only an image of loss, it is also a lullaby, the sound of a living world taking back what was loaned to stone. If you listen closely enough, you can hear both the praise and the warning in the same leaf rustle. Praise for a people who counted, planned, and built a cosmos you could walk through. Warning for any people who forget that calendars do not command the sky, that reservoirs must expect a long, dry season, that kings, however sacred, cannot cut their way into rain. We will keep faith with the story, resisting easy answers while collecting the good ones. There will be moments of marvel, the cool gold of a mosaic dawn, the precise geometry of a temple stair traced by sunlight, and moments of ache, when we follow one family to the edge of their city and feel the weight of the choice to leave. Through it all, we will remember what the Maya themselves taught, that time moves in cycles, that endings are also returns, and that silence is not always empty. Sometimes it is the space where a new way to live begins to take root. The men who first persuaded the wider world to take these cities seriously were an unlikely pair stitched together by curiosity. John Lloyd Stevens was an American lawyer turned diplomat and best-selling travel writer, restless for places that the map still treated as rumor. Frederick Catherwood was a British architect and artist with an engineer's tolerance for exactness and a poet's patience, a man who could stare at a single line until it told the truth. In 1839, carrying letters of introduction and the stubborn idea that the reports could not all be fancy, they headed into the hot, green interior of what is now Honduras and Guatemala. Nothing about the journey was gentle. They rode mules along tracks that dissolved into mud at the first afternoon storm. Mosquitoes gathered on their hands in such dense veils that a single sweep left the air briefly clear and the skin stippled with blood. Small wars crackled from town to town, columns of men in mismatched uniforms, muskets bright with recent oil, officers whose courtesies could turn hard without warning. They bargained for escorts over tables, sticky with spilled coffee. They waited for bridges to be rebuilt plank by plank after a flash flood. And they learned quickly that favor could evaporate as fast as a puddle at noon. And then, after days of cutting through secondary growth that closed again overnight, they stepped into a silence so complete the jungle itself seemed to be listening. Before them rose Copán. Stelae, tall stone slabs, stood like sentinels in a glade, their faces crowded with portraits of kings and curls of symbols no one they knew could read. Stairways climbed out of shadow into green. Everywhere, the carvings held a confidence that felt immediate, not borrowed, stylized jaws and feathered snakes, hands cupped around scepters, profiles that were both human and God-touched. Catherwood saw at once that this was high art, precise, consistent, informed by rules as strict as any he knew from Greece. Stevens grasped the deeper shock. This was not the work of Egyptians wandering very far west, nor of Romans washed ashore by story. It was a wholly American genius speaking in its own voice. Stevens did something naive and oddly protective, fearing that neglect would finish what time had begun. He bought the ruins from a local landholder for $50, less a conquest than a promise to keep watch. Then he set about the task that would make the place unignorable, he wrote, while he filled his journals with weather and politics, with mule bites and amiable lies told over aguardiente. Catherwood unfolded a device called a camera lucida and went to work. Sunlight and lenses cast the faintest ghost of an image onto his paper, his hand, swollen from bites, traced and retraced until the lines were more faithful than any hurried sketch could be. He kept his drawings cool, no romantic fog, no heroic figures added for scale. Pillars were pillars, glyphs were glyphs. If a corner had broken, the break was shown. It was accuracy as reverence, their path unspooled into wider marvels. At Quirigua, they faced monuments so massive and intricately carved that the stone seemed to have grown scales and feathers. At Palenque, in Chiapas, the palace rose with airy galleries and a tower that gathered the wind. Delicate stucco figures leaning from walls as if to listen. In the Yucatan, at Uxmal, a steep pyramid shouldered out of the scrub, and the governor's palace stretched itself along the ridge like a sentence written in careful capitals. The men sketched until sweat ran into their eyes, and the paper bowed with humidity. They wrapped the pages at night and prayed the roof would hold. If you leaf through those pictures now, you can feel the discipline in them. Catherwood marked not merely beauty, but method, the way stoneworkers repeated a motif with small variations, the way roof combs thrust above temple tops like headdresses, the way glyphs nest into square blocks to be read in order. He drew the serpent bars in royal hands and the dates framed in circles and bars that would later be revealed as counts of days. He did not know the words, but he honored the grammar. When Stevens's incidents of travel in Central America, Chiapas, and Yucatan appeared, filled with Catherwood's plates, it was not a book so much as a hinge. The world swung. Readers who would never smell leaf rot or hear a howler in their lives stared at engravings that refused to play along with prejudice. The old fantasy these must be the work of someone else. Some vanished visitors from across the sea withered under the sheer specificity of the art. These were local kings in local crowns, local gods with local names. The Americas had produced a civilization that could stand without apology beside any other. The sensation was not only aesthetic, it was a change in weather. Museums took notice, universities, grudging at first and then eager, funded expeditions. Catherwood himself published a portfolio of views that set a standard for archaeological illustration. Stevens wrote again, and then again, carrying his readers up causeways and under lintels with the easy, companionable voice of a man who assumes you're intelligent and curious. In the decades that followed, other names joined the work. Modesto Mendez, A Guatemalan administrator trekked to the estranged towers of Tikal and brought back news of pyramids whose tops pierced the canopy like ships' masts. Alfred Maudsley arrived with cameras and patience, taking photographs that arrested time and making papier-mâché casts of inscriptions so exact that the scholars a continent away could run their fingers over borrowed stone. Yet for a long while the cities remained eloquent and mute at once. The carvings were admired as decoration, not read as language. Scholars of the Victorian kind preferred to find calendars and gods and leave it at that. It was safer, and it kept the people who made the works pleasantly vague genius without biography. The glyphs, with their elegance and repetition, seemed to confirm the mistake. They were, after all, so beautiful. Surely that was their point. The truth, when it came, would be another hinge a story for later tonight. But even without reading the words, even standing at the threshold of understanding, Stevens and Catherwood had opened a door that would not shut again. They had also, without quite meaning to, drawn a line that would lead to questions the cities could not easily answer. If this civilization had built so much, so well, for so long, where had its builders gone? Why did the monuments cease? Why did the jungle take the plazas back, reel by patient reel? It is tempting to linger with them in the rooms where they did their work. Catherwood, under a thatch roof at noon, one hand shading the paper, the other translating shadow to line, Stevens sitting cross-legged at the end of a day, writing by candle about a king's face that seemed somehow both sorrowful and sure. Outside, the forest breathes. A lizard ticks across a warm stone. A boy from the nearest village, hired to carry water, leans in the doorway for a moment and looks at what the foreigner is drawing his own ancestors, their names unspoken and their hands steady. The boy does not need a camera lucida to know the proportions are true. He nods once, as if to himself, and goes. The books found their way into parlors where winters were long. Pages turned under hands wearing kid gloves. Travelers who had never traveled tried on the explorer's eyes for an hour and felt themselves better for it. But the deeper change happened on the ground. The casual looting that had chipped noses off masks and hauled altars into gardens did not stop, but it slowed under the new glare of attention. Local pride, too often trampled by the old condescensions, drew itself up. These were not ruins in the sense of neglect. They were cities laid down by grandparents of grandparents. Work that had no need of rescue other than time and respect. What Stevens and Catherwood could not do. Others would attempt, they could not. For instance, explain the sudden hush in the long song of dates carved on stone how, after centuries of recording births and accessions and wars with the neatness of an accountant. The tradition falters in the late 8th century and falls quiet not long after. They could not connect the broken causeways across a plaza to broken weather in the sky, or the clipped march of a mural's warriors to fortification ditches thrown up in panic. They could not know that. In caves not far from the plazas where they camped, stalagmites were keeping an exact diary of drought and rain, but they sent us there with their pages in our pack. For now, hold the image that began to move the world, two men standing in a clearing, the air heavy, a high wall of leaves pressing in, and in front of them a king in a stone with an expression made somehow of authority and time. Around his face, a frame of symbols, precise as lungs. No one in that moment can read them, and yet you feel the pressure of meaning like a sealed letter in the hand. The next part of our journey opens it carefully and lets the voice inside speak. Only then can we ask the hardest questions and hope for answers that do not rush, that do not flatter us with certainty, and that, for all their coolness, still carry the ache of a people who measured the sky and built as if it would always be kind. When the vines were pushed back and the first careful drawings made, a picture slowly emerged, not of a single empire with a crown at its center, but of a living web. The classic Maya world was a constellation of city-states, each bright on its patch of forest, each with its own dynasty, its own patron gods, its own rivalries and pride. Tikal, Calakmul, Copán, Palenque, names now spoken softly in museum halls, once listened for one another across distances measured in days' marches and river bends. Alliances braided and unbraided with marriages, embassies, and blows carefully timed to the calendar. A victory might mean a captured lord paraded in feathers and ropes, not a city razed to the ground. For centuries the game was ritualized, strategic, and personal. More chess than storm. Daily life ran on maize. The Maya were, in a way, they themselves declared, the people of corn. In the milpa, the mixed field, maize rose in green ranks while beans climbed its stalks, and the squash shaded the soil, a three-sister partnership that fed villages generation after generation. In poor earth, they coaxed fertility with terraces on hillsides, with raised fields in seasonal swamps, with canals that laced wetlands into gardens. They opened Chultan's bottle-shaped cisterns in the limestone and led rain there by gutters cut in plaster. In cities that grew too large to drink from springs alone, they carved vast reservoirs, their floors sealed with bright white lime. A dry season could be endured if the basins were full and the priest astronomers had read the sky correctly. Around those basins rose a stone. Maya architecture grew from a patient mastery of local materials. Quarries lay just beyond the city edge. Blocks were prized from bedrock and levered along packed roads to temple platforms. Roofs used the corbel vaulted stones stepped inward till two walls nearly touched and could be sealed with a final slab, creating cool rooms where incense kept its shape in the air. Builders finished their work with a skin of stucco so white it seemed to create its own light, then painted it reds, blues born from indigo and clay, black that made glyphs stand sharp as memory, causeways. The Sakbiab white roads stitched neighborhoods to plazas and outlying shrines to city hearts, shining in moonlight after rain like the Milky Way mirrored on earth. Politics wore its sacred face. The ruler was the Kuhul Ajal, the holy lord who stood not only above his people, but between worlds. He was expected to fight, to judge, to distribute tribute and wealth, but most of all, to keep the cosmic order tuned and turning. Blood was his most eloquent offering. In ritual, he drew it from his tongue, his earlobes, sometimes from a cord pulled through a pierced wound, a stingray's spine, or polished obsidian as the instrument, bark paper as the witness. The paper drank the blood and then burned. Smoke lifted in the shape of a serpent, and through its open jaws, ancestors and gods were said to speak. The queen could serve as co-celebrant, Stelae show royal women summoning vision serpents with the same grave composure as their husbands, their hair heavy with jade and shell. This was the great bargain the people fed the court with maize and labor. The court fed the gods with suffering willingly given. The gods returned rain as long as each did its part. The gears in heaven and the gears on earth meshed. Markets gave the bargain texture. On appointed days, plazas swelled with trade salt in cakes white as bone, cacao beans counted out like coin, obsidian blades whose edges could part a hair, jade from the Motagua Valley carved to a celadon gleam, spondylus shell orange as fire, cotton mantles fine enough to fold into a hand. A mother ran her thumb along a pot's lip to feel the potter's confidence. A scribe chose the smoothest deer hide for a new codex. A fisherman from the coast held up a stingray spine with the careful pride of a man offering both a tool and a piece of the sea. Crafts nested into one another. Stone carvers learned to make faces live in a plane less than the width of a child's finger. Painters developed a calligraphic line black and assured that could write a bird's wing in a single sweep. Scribes folded long strips of bark paper into accordion books, brushed with lime to take ink, and then filled with glyphs and gods. Even the ball game played on masonry courts with walls that returned a sound like drums. Braided work and worship, rubber balls thumped and aslit, players in padded belts and headdresses sent the sphere skimming off sloped markers. The game was a story retold, the hero twins of deep myth, tricking death with grace, and sometimes a sentence pronounced. For captives could be sacrificed at the ritual's end. Around the court, vendors sold atole and gossip near the markers. Nobles wagered silently with hand signs learned young. The cities breathed ceremony. Processions moved like rivers' priests under feathered fans. Musicians with turtle-shell drums. Lines of bearers with incense burners shaped like gods. On the stairways, dancers stepped in patterns that echoed the constellations, their sandals whispering on plaster. We can still feel the mathematics beneath the beauty temples, precisely oriented to solstice sunrise, windows that catch the planet Venus at first appearance, staircases whose shadows become a serpent on a particular evening in spring. Time itself felt tangible, a fabric woven from repeating cycles that promised return even as lives turned and ended. Warfare fit inside this rhythm. At least for a long time, an expedition might set out under an auspicious Venus morning star, its aim a rival's lord rather than his people. Armor was cotton-quilted thick and salt-hardened, light enough to run in. Shields were painted wood. Spear throwers sent obsidian-tipped darts with a speed that made the air make a sound. The taking of a noble captive lifted a ruler's name, the sacrifice of that captive. Staged and witnessed, fed the city's story of itself. Still I recorded such triumphs with a restraint that makes them read like ledgers, the date, the event, the names, the god's approval properly invoked, and yet beneath ceremony lay compromise and care, councils of nobles' lineage men with claims of their own balanced a king's reach. Scribes and astronomer priests advised according to a scion count, merchants with routes to guard and partners to keep, pressed for caution in seasons when roads turned to soup or when news from a neighboring valley smelled of famine. The ruler, for all his God-touched aura, was stitched to 1,000 practicalities, the repair of a reservoir wall after a heavy storm, the quiet settlement of a feud over irrigation, the appointment of a trustworthy steward to a hill town too far to visit often, inside households. Life was narrower and no less intricate. Women ground maize at dawn on metates, worn concave by generations of hands. Their shoulders carried the rhythm into the day. Children learned the courtesy of listening to older voices. Boys watched their fathers chip obsidian until edges flashed. Girls traced weaving patterns with a finger on the mother's skirt and then learned to make those patterns sing on a backstrap loom. Dogs barked at nothing and then at something real. Turkeys fussed. Smoke from breakfast fires rose through roof thatch and drifted in blue layers above the lanes. Religion reached into these rooms without raising its voice. A clay figurine of a household god sat in a niche. A grandmother tied a red thread at a baby's wrist to persuade the world to be kind. The day's date, known by its two sacred counters, carried a reputation good for beginning, good for pleading, best left alone, if a child fell ill. Copal resin burned and words ran like water if a good harvest came. The first tortillas were laid before a small altar, steam rising into air that had been fed by prayers for rain. At the scale of centuries, the system looked durable. From about 250 to 800 CE, the southern lowlands glittered with building and thought. Tikal's stepped giants shouldered up through canopy. Palenque's palace tower caught winds and rumors. Copán's stairway accumulated history step by step in glyphs. Calakmul, the snake kingdom, pushed and gathered vassals with a patience that felt like weather more than will. Population climbed, craftsmen refined, ritual found ever finer edges. To an onlooker standing on a temple's upper platform around the year 750, the future might have seemed as stable as a stone. But a stone has joints, systems have strains. The very success of sacred kingship made rain personal. A mist season weighed on a single back. The brilliance of architecture demanded forests for lime and fuel. Fields pushed outward. Hills lost their grip on soil. Trade routes stretched further, tying city health to the quiet of roads and the temper of neighbors. None of this was crisis by itself. All of it together made a civilization that required attention everywhere at once. And attention, like rain, can falter for the moment. Though, keep the view from the plaza, a scribe sits cross-legged in the shade, a bowl of soot ink at his knee, a brush charged to paint a date that fixes a king's triumph in time. A mason wipes plaster smooth with the heel of his hand and sees the sky turn suddenly in the sheen. A farmer coming in with a squash on a pole pauses to watch a procession and feels, as the shells rattle and the drum speaks, that his own breath matches the city's rhythm. The bargain holds. The reservoirs are full enough. The snakes in the carvings look pleased. The words to describe this world were there all along, cut into stelae, painted into codices for decades after rediscovery. No one outside the descendant communities could read them, and so the cities seemed silent. They were not. They were speaking in a hand as exact as a surveyor's, telling, line by patient line, the sequence of lives, the shape of time, the rules by which the game was played. Soon enough, voices from far-off desks and camp stools would hear the logic, break the code, and turn art back into speech. With that, the classic world would step forward and give its own account of births and accessions, of battles won, of rain petitioned and received, and, eventually, of a silence no ritual could resolve. At dusk, the cities looked upward. Fireflies stitched low constellations in the reeds wall above. The sky repeated itself with a patience that made worry feel small. The Maya did more than watch that repetition. They learned it until it became a language. If the classic world was held together by maze and ritual, its spine was time, counted with a precision that still feels tender in astonishing dots and bars scored on stone, numbers stepping like careful feet across bark paper books. Temples turned to catch a particular light on a particular morning that would not return for a year. They counted with 20. You can see the reason when a child wriggles his toes by the hearth. Fingers and feet make a tidy tally. 1 was a dot, 5 a bar, and 0 true 0 was a shell, a little hollow place for nothing to sit. That symbol changed everything. Place value could now be trusted. Long counts could be stacked. Dates could be written like ladders the way rain is stored in steps built into a reservoir's wall. Numbers were set from bottom to top ones, kin at the base. Then 20s winol, then a thoughtful exception, 18-inch 20 tune to keep the calendar year near the suns. Then further rungs katun, bektun, so that a king could fix his life not merely in seasons, but in spans that made dynasties feel like hours measured well. Calendars nested like baskets. The tzolkin was the sacred one, 260 days. 2 wheels turning together a cycle of 13 and a cycle of 20 each day, named and numbered, with a personality people knew the way they knew the weather of a month. Midwives listened for it, diviners leaned on it, rulers consulted it before they opened a war bundle or a treaty. Running beside it was the Hab. The solar round 365 days arranged as 18 months of 20 plus a small, anxious fringe of 5 called Wayeb. When doors were shut early and luck was considered brittle, every 52 Hob years the 2 wheels realigned and the calendar round repeated. A slow click, like the sound of a heavy door settling back into its frame. For memory beyond a lifetime, the long count did the work. A birth, an accession, a war, a temple dedication, these could be placed in a chain of days, reaching back to a mythical beginning. On a stelae in plazas where incense hung, scribes set down dates with a care that feels almost audible. 9:15.0, polar 0.0, each position a place in the cosmic ledger. Each dot and bar a promise that the event recorded would not float loose. When people today whisper about the number 13 point, they think of endings. For the Maya, it was a hinge. Cycles conclude and begin in the same breath. No panic. Only the quiet click of a clock that knows more than we do about patience. Astronomy was not a hobby. It was governance written in light. The priests who watched the sky did so with instruments as simple as a knotted cord and as exact as a lifetime of practice. Venus was their fierce companion. They tracked its 584-day synodic dance with such care that their tables could predict its reappearance as morning star, a blade in the dawn, whose rising could color a campaign as auspicious or perilous. Eclipses, too, were marked and measured. Scenes in codices show bands of numbers that are not myth but mathematics. Periods of moon danger counted so that rituals might be timed to keep fear from spreading like dye in water. Buildings obeyed these reckonings. Some temple stairways gather a serpent each spring and autumn afternoon, shadows stack and unstack along the balustrade in a writhing triangle that turn a stone into story for a few minutes and then lets it go. Observatory towers puncture skyline rooms with slit windows that catch a first glint of Venus or the far northing of the sun. Across the lowlands, older groups of platforms broad, low, aligned to horizons gave a kind of calendar in geometry. At dawns, set aside the sun appearing over a marker in June, over another in December. Arguments live in those alignments today. But even the arguments admit respect. Somebody cared enough to make a building into a number you can walk inside. Scribes were the translators between sky and city. You can picture one in a colonnade's shade brush made from a Maggie thorn set in a reed, palette a clam shell smeared with black and red, paper folded like a bellows across his knee. He touches the brush to ink and brings down a day sign cleanly, then another, then a number that will seat the name in time. The glyphs are art jaguars grinning, serpents with breath turned to scrolls, but they are also phonetic, syllables singing back a spoken language, so that a single king's name can be written as a portrait, or sounded out piece by piece, or both at once if the scribe feels like showing off. Around him, a murmur of training apprentices learning that a hand can be taught to be exact without losing tenderness. Timekeeping reached into households as much as onto monuments. A marriage day could be chosen to lean toward harmony rather than quarrel. A journey might start on a number that liked beginnings. Farmers felt in their shoulders what the Hab told them the month when digging sticks meet soil, the hot lull when water jars need more watching, the early rains that wake the milpa into green. All of it had names, and names give worry somewhere to go. The calendars did not force fate. They offered a grammar for hope. The love of a schedule seeped into games and theater. At the ball court, a match could be set to dovetail with a date the priest preferred. The bounce and thump of rubber under a painted marker had a breath count to it. You could hum in festival season. Masked dancers took their cues not just from a drum, but from the turn of a cycle. They moved as constellations move in imagination, rarely fast, always sure. The king's own body obeyed the math. Bloodlettings were not performed when the mood took him, but when the count matched the reason and anniversary of a dynasty's founding. The dear God listens quickly. A moment when the Venus table says now. A sweetness runs through the precision. The zero shell is a favorite example. It looks like an ear or a seed pod. It holds emptiness as something gentle, not frightening. With it, you can say nothing in a place where a number belongs and yet keep counting. With it, you can step from one rung to the next without stumbling. The thought is so direct, it feels like sunlight on tools you didn't need a big machine to keep centuries in order. You need a symbol, a habit, a school. We like to imagine ancient astronomers as people who never looked down. But the Maya maps are filled with Earth. Rain does not come because you have tallied Venus. It comes because the basin wall holds and the spillway works, and the gods are honored in a way that lets people breathe. The calendar's beauty is not how clever it is, but how useful. Under drought, a count can ration endurance. Under plenty, it can schedule thanks so that feasts don't spoil. And labor isn't wasted under a punishing sun. Those stelae in plazas always the dates first. Then the deed read now like patient diaries. A child born in a year when the tzolkin had a friendly face. An accession blessed under a certain number tied to maize. a victory when the morning star returned sharp to the eastern edge. Then, years later, a dedication, a stairway whose risers are not only stone but text, each a step another sentence in the city's self-portrait. The voice is formal, but the result is intimate. You can follow a life from first naming to final write. With the same certainty, you can follow a river's bends on a map. It is tempting to look at this elegance and see inevitability, as if a people who could keep time so well could not lose it. But cycles have humility built into them. The same tables that set a feast can measure a famine. The same observatory that catches Venus can note a season that slides long and dry in the years ahead. The counts would continue to click while reservoirs shrank. The glyph for ends would keep its graceful curve while kings found fewer reasons to stand in front of it with confidence. Numbers do not fail. They tell you quietly what is failing. For now, hold the quiet image a night in which the Milky Way looks like poured chalk. A tower window cut to frame a first star's return. A priest marking the horizon with a gesture that is also a prayer. Below, in courtyards smoothed with plaster, families settle, a mother rinses a gourd, a father checks a door bar, an older child, allowed to stay up a little longer, leans back until the world is mostly sky and whispers the day's name to memorize how it feels in the mouth. Time is not abstract here. It is a neighbor, counted and greeted, asked for favor and forgiven when it forgets. Soon, the city will ask more of it than it can give. At their height, the cities breathed like living things. Dawn spilled into plazas of pale plaster, and the first feet of market sellers dusted that brightness with a soft grit. Smoke from cook fires rose in blue cords, and somewhere a conch called the day awake. The classic Maya world around the middle of the 8th century moved with a confidence that made time itself feel domesticated. Temples and palaces stood not as isolated marvels, but as organs in an ordered body ball courts that held ritual games. Council houses where decisions were unrolled like bark paper books. Sanctuaries where incense softened a stone. And long, white causeways, sac biob, stretching between neighborhoods and out to satellites like threads of moonlight you could walk. Water, the quiet master of every city, had been persuaded to serve. At Tikal, the reservoirs lay like great mirrors, their edges neat with facing stones, stairways stepping down so 1,000 hands could draw without churning mud. In their walls lay careful layers, clay for sealing, gravel for strength, and, in places, beds of clean sand and a pale mineral that strained impurity so efficiently that the rain kept its sweetness even after a long, hot month. Palenque tucked an aqueduct beneath a plaza and sent a pressurized jet from a hidden outlet, a fountain masquerading as miracle. Elsewhere, where the land pressed its knee into the ribs of cultivable soil, farmers stitched terraces, each couched in limestone, each holding back a skin of earth and a bright filigree of maize roots against torrential summer rain. The city's face, those proud pyramids, was not bare. Stone bones were sheathed in smooth lime-plaster, spread in coats and burnished until sunlight pooled on them like water. Some facades woke further when painters came, laying cinnabar reds and Maya blues. The latter a marriage of clay and indigo that resisted time with the stubbornness of a prayer. Roof combs climbed from temple summits like crests on a helmet, carved in lattice and masks so a building could wear its own genealogy. Walk close and you read on stone what scribes had inked on bark names of kings and queens, captives and victories, the exact stepping of dates, dots, bars, and the curled shell of zero that made the counting clean. Beneath the ceremonial skin, work moved at a human scale, in a workshop that was smelled of damp earth and soot. A potter coiled walls for a cylinder vase, his hand smoothing the seam until it disappeared. A scribe painted it in a fast, sure hand with courtly scenes and captions that chimed with the real spoken language, syllables wrapped in art. In a darker corner, someone drilled jade with a string and a bit, and a patience that had no modern analogy, making a bead that would glow green against a white throat at a festival. In the palace kitchens, cacao was ground with a stone roller and whipped with water into a foam you could blow to see the bubbles tremble with gold. Out in the neighborhoods, ordinary hearts worked a quieter magic. Nixtamalized maize cooked into masa, pressed into tortillas, dropped with a slap onto a comal. Beans and squash simmered. Chilies roasted until the air had a warm, prickly scent. Trade laced everything together. Obsidian arrived as razors from the highland flows of El Chayal and Ixtepeque. Its edges so fine they seemed to think for themselves as they cut. Jade rode down from the Motagua Valley like pieces of captive river turned into stone. Shells from 2 seas clicked together in market baskets. Quetzal feathers in improbable green traveled by hand and promise. Salt came from the flat white bones of the far north, a necessity measured by headaches when it ran short. Cacao beans, small, brown, fragrant with wealth, could stand in for coin when accounts got particular. Canoes on coasts and slow rivers moved like commas in a long sentence, pausing where a village's dock offered oranges and news. On land, widened tracks and sakbiop carried feet and litters in processions of daily purpose. Under the pomp, there lived a habit of a schedule. Market days returned with a rhythm tied to the sacred count. Plazas thickened and thinned like lungs. A buyer ran a thumb along the edge of a blade to feel its promise. A seller tipped a gourd of beans into a measuring cup worn smooth by honesty. A child clenched a single cacao bean in his fist like a treasure and learned that value is what moves between hands with a story. In the audience hall, officials in cotton and shell listened, and a runner in white bark cloth waited at the door with a message tube for the Lord. In a neighboring town, news of a birth, a predicted eclipse, a date proposed for a treaty's binding, ritual threaded everywhere without turning life into pageant. On appointed days, masks came down from shelves and took human faces around the eyes and mouth. Dancers stepped patterns their grandparents had known. Drums spoke the big syllables, while flutes embroidered smaller ones. On the ball court, teams shouldered a game that was more than play hips, knees, and shoulders guiding a heavy rubber sun through a narrow world. Stone rings weighted high and mostly untroubled goals you could witness in a lifetime if you were patient and lucky. In stands and on walls, painted lords watched with a serenity that looked like thoughtfulness and was also politics. Kings and queens, for all their titles, were not abstractions. Their bodies were instruments. They sat on thrones carved with a weight that traveled up into their spines and down into the floor. They fasted when the almanac said to. They bled when the calendar required and burned that offering so that smoke could become speech. Their children learned stiffness of regalia, the exact angle of a hand raised to bless. The names of ancestors stacked like stairs behind them, each a weight, each a support, when they stepped out for a public dedication. The world noticed the details: a jade mosaic belt, a jade-backed mirror where a face could float like a captured moon, cloth that moved with a hush because it had been woven tight enough to hold a secret. Around them, the city's common rooms kept time differently. Field days started with the horizon barely thinking about light. Digging sticks punctured soil in rhythms that matched breath. When rains came hard, the milpa, row by row, went green like a held note. When dry days stretched, jars were checked and checked again, lids tied down. Small arguments over scoops moderated by a grandmother's voice from the doorway. Children learned to carry water without spilling, to grind maize without a stone's catching, to step sideways around a dog asleep exactly where foot traffic insisted on flowing. Songs kept pace with work, and work kept a family from ever being entirely at the mercy of weather or price. If you stood high in a temple doorway and looked out, what you saw would have felt both immense and controlled. In one direction, a palace quadrangle, its galleries cool, its wooden lintels carved with dates and riddled with beetle holes. In another, a plaza where a stela rose like a finger explaining itself in glyphs. Beyond that, a neighborhood of house mounds, a patio group here, another there, each with its hearth, each with a little altar stone polished by prayer and elbow. Further still, the smudge of a swamp turned field by patient hands who had learned how to lay down brush and earth in layers until water agreed to do its work slowly rather than all at once. This abundance had a nervous edge even then, though most felt it only as busyness come harvest time, as the way wood piles seemed to shrink faster than they used to when new plaster went on the temple steps, as talk of more hands needed in the quarries traveled along the Sagbe, like gossip no one could pin to a single mouth. The system had worked for centuries because it matched the land's grain, rain caught and kept, soil nudged but not bullied. Populations held tight to reservoirs like beads strung onto a cord. To grow was to make the cord longer, to add beads carefully, to test the knot. At night, the city changed key. The heat went out of the stone as if the day had been water boiling in a pot, now set aside. Crickets took the air back from humans. In courtyards, people lay on mats and told children the story of the three-stone hearth, the sky's hearth too, and how the first fire began. Someone whispered the names of the months of the Hab, the characters of the Tzolkin days as if they were cousins. A teenage boy tested a new song quietly and decided he hated it. A woman folded her huipil just so, because tomorrow was market again and you do not go to sell with wrinkles. On temple tops, a priest watched a star slide to where it always slides and felt a tiny nut of satisfaction click into place inside his chest. Nothing in this scene feels like a prelude to silence. That is the nature of peaks. They borrow certainty from repetition. The stonemasons will show up tomorrow. The plaster will cure white. The aqueduct will murmur under its lid. The scribe will finish the caption. He paused mid-syllable. The reservoir steps will hold the feet of women laughing as they balance jars. And yet the ledger that underlies the city's confidence is thin. The balance holds so long as rain remembers, as forest regrows faster than fires eat. as labor stretches to match a lord's imagination, as a treaty holds long enough for the next one to be conceived. For now, the accounts reconcile. For now, the city sleeps and dreams of itself intact. The first hint that the great machine was missing teeth did not come as fire. It came as silence. For centuries, the classic Maya had dated their triumphs with a precision that felt like music scored in a stone, each stela a chord, each temple dedication another bar in a long composition. Then, unexpectedly, the tempo faltered. At Palenque, the drumbeat stops on 799. At Copán, the notes hang in the air until 822 and then do not resolve. At Tikal, the last proud count is 869, a monument standing like a held breath. After that, the plazas no longer announce themselves to time. The kings, who had once shouted their names across centuries, now whisper and, at last, fall quiet. Archaeologists trace this hush with a finger across carved dates as if touching a wound. It is not that the people disappear at once, markets are still open, fires still cook the day's mesa. Children still run along the plaster pavements until their heel marks make a faint gray polish. But the public voice, the performative certainty of divine kingship, dims. Where there should be a new stela, there is a leveled base and nothing raised upon it. Where a roof comb should pierce the sky, the scaffolds stand idle and then rot. The chisel song fades in the quarries. In more than one city, great projects stall in mid-gesture broad causeways left half-paved, ball courts whose side walls stop abruptly as if a command were shouted and every hand simply set down its tool. Walk those unfinished spaces in your mind, a plaza half-dressed on one side, a skin of bright plaster, burnished and ready for paint. On the other, rough limestone waiting for lime that never came. Blocks lie in ordered stacks beside the path, their edges still sharp, red ochre guidelines visible under dust. A scribe's ink bowl stands on a ledge, the pigment inside congealed to a cracked skin, the color of dried blood. It looks less like ruin than like interruption. Something that was supposed to be brief has become permanent. The city's body begins to defend itself. Places that once greeted the world with open arms now pull their elbows in. Around the ceremonial hearths, a palace court here, a temple group there, new walls rise in haste, lower, cruder, meant to repel a particular fear rather than to proclaim a general confidence. Ditches are cut, palisades bristle where processions used to pass unhindered. The elegant logic of older defenses, moats like the one at Beacon, ramparts planned into a site's original grammar are replaced by quick, anxious lines, as if the city has suddenly learned to flinch. There are quieter clues too, elite pottery, the polychrome cylinders that once danced with courtly scenes and long captions grows plain. The slip loses its luster, the brush hand hurries and stumbles. Jade becomes rarer, its drilling less delicate, shell inlays fall out and are not replaced. The long-distance exchanges that kept the upper classes glittering obsidian from a favored source, feathers from a particular valley, pigments with the right stubbornness break and reroute or stop in middens. The trash of daily life tells on its owners. Meals lean harder on maize and less on meat. Fish bones from distant waters thin out. The charred remains of firewood shift from hardwoods to whatever will burn. Even inside palaces, the story tilts. In more than one royal compound, hearths appear where none should be, crude fire rings set on fine plaster floors. smoke stains blackening the undersides of carved beams, squatters, most likely, or retainers making do in rooms once meant only for ceremony. It is as if the house of the gods has been demoted to a shelter against weather and fear. In the storerooms, caches are disturbed and then not reburied with care. In tombs, grave goods are taken and the dead left disarranged. This is not the vandalism of a foreign conqueror. It is the shabby economy of people squeezed to make choices their grandparents never imagined. None of this happens everywhere at once. While the southern lowlands dim the Piton's big names faltering, the forest creeping closer to plazas, another landscape to the north brightens. The Yucatan's drier, flatter country, with its peppering of cenotes and its coastlines friendly to canoes, begins to gather power. New capitals lift their heads, a city of warriors and merchants at Chichén Itzá. The Puc Hills, sprouting facades so densely patterned, they look woven from a stone uxmal. Kaaba, Labna, colonnades appear, and courts scaled for assemblies broader than a single royal clan. The visual language changes without losing its Maya grammar. Feathered serpent imagery expands. Columns invite crowds to shelter and talk. Maritime trade glitters in port towns whose wharves smell of salt and honey and cotton. The divergence is important. It reminds us that collapse is not a thunderclap but a slow redistribution, a long weather front passing over a map. The southern cities, the classic heartland, enter what the scholars call the terminal classic, a phrase that sounds like a diagnosis, 750 to 900 and a little after. A season of a strain that in one place means defensive trench and in another means a family leaving its courtyard with bundles and silence. Meanwhile, the north leans into the sea and grows outward, exchanging inland certainty for coastal flexibility. Later, the story of those northern centuries will demand its own chapter. For now, their rise throws the southern quiet into sharper relief. If you listen for footsteps, you hear them changing pace. Runners once famous for the speed between allied courts now carry darker letters, messages couched in euphemism that every receiver reads with a pinch of salt and an extra guard at the gate. Farmers hesitate before breaking new ground. The soil looks thinner. The ash from this year's burn already more reluctant to take. Traders take alternate routes to avoid the stretch of road suddenly unsafe. And the side path, once walked by a handful each week, becomes the road. A weaver set aside a bolder design because the dyer cannot promise the exact blue. A potter keeps a jar undecorated, knowing it will sell anyway to a house where the difference between handsome and plain has been swallowed by other urgencies. There are human bodies in this story. Skeletons from late layers tell of a stress before the last breath lines in dental enamel marking. Childhoods interrupted by hunger. Bone chemistry hinting at diets too narrow for too many seasons. Joints wearing differently, as if more people carried more water farther. In places, there are mass burials where there should be careful separations, signs of sudden deaths, or a diminished capacity to grieve with architecture. The old rituals go on, how could they not, but they feel. In the inscriptions that survive, more frantic. The same rites repeat at shorter intervals. Offerings grow larger and then, abruptly, smaller. Even the king's names crowd closer together on some late monuments, as if reigns have shortened and the stone cannot quite keep up. All the while, the calendar ticks. The Hab counts the agricultural year that becomes harder to manage. The Shulkin whispers auspicious days that arrive as always. Whether or not anyone has the resources to honor them properly, the long count, so faithful for so long, stands like a banker waiting for a payment that will not come. When the monuments stop, it is not the end of time, it is an end to a certain way of telling time, the public way, the way that binds a people to a lord and a lord to the sky by a chain of carved numbers and remembered ceremonies. We should be careful the cities do not at once become green mounds. Generations live through the in-between. There are still weddings and ball games and quarrels about boundaries. There are still songs so catchy a grandmother sighs while a child sings it for the 10th time. But the rooms of power grow staler. The paint peels. The runners spend more days with the look of men who know the road too well. When a fight comes, it is not always a grand clash of emblazoned lords. More often, it is a scrap for a storehouse, a night raid on a field, a skirmish over a spring whose water now runs lower than memory says it should. A handful of telltale places mark this transition like exclamation points. In the Petex Batun, Dos Piles blooms quick and dies younger than it meant to. Its last refuge fortified in a hurry. At Aguateca, meals go cold on benches as if interrupted by a shout. At Punta de Chimino, peninsulas are cut into islands with ditches sharp as knives. Elsewhere, cities defend their hearts and then insist. Hollowing out, the citizenry drifts. First the young, then the households with fewer elders to argue for staying, then, at last, even those who had said they would leave only as smoke. It is tempting to look back down the timeline and ask for the moment one that would let us say there. That was the day. But the early signs look like ordinary life until there are enough of them. A ledger that doesn't balance one season can be patched by borrowing from another. A wall thrown up in haste can be prettied later. The installing of a causeway looks, for a while, like a pause. Only when you step back far enough to see dates as a forest do you notice how many trees have stopped growing. Still, for a last time, let us linger in a plaza at dusk in those years, when the silence is gathering but not complete. The light falls sweetly. A vendor sells tamales with a good joke. Somewhere a priest consults a codex and, finding the sign he hoped for, breathes easier for an hour on a bench. An old couple tries to remember a dedication that took place when they were children and cannot agree on the color of the standard or the tune of the drum. Tomorrow, perhaps, a work gang will show up and finish that stretch of plaster. Tomorrow, perhaps, a runner will bring welcome news from a neighbor. Tomorrow still comes. Even at the edge of the story, it is only later that the edge reveals itself as an ending. Before the jungles closed their hands, the cities clenched their fists. Classic Maya warfare had long been a performance within a strict lines, prestige raids guided by omen and calendar. Battles staged to seize noble captives whose humiliation and sacrifice fed the gods and burnished a king's right to rule. War was a ritual conversation, bloody but bounded, then a slowly at first, and finally all at once the conversation turned into a shout. You can see the change in a stone. Early lintels and a stele dwell on formal captures. A single lord kneels, hands bound, as a victorious Ajaw stands over him, the glyphs spelling the names with chilly grace. Later, the imagery crowds and darkens. Walls bloom with masked ranks. clashing in swirls of feather and jaguar pelt. Shields jammed against shields, spears like reeds in a storm. On murals at Bonampak, the aftermath is almost unbearable. Lords with fingernails torn, blood strung like red thread, the rigid faces of officials rehearsing composure while the room swims with pain. This is not the measured theater of a single body offered to a single god. It is a harvest. The texts stiffen too, where once a monument might commemorate a lord's accessions and a handful of ritual victories. Later, stones tabulate Star Wars battles launched under Venus's razor-bright auspice like grim accountancy. War dates a stack near Venus's morning star phase, the warrior's star. As priest astronomers mark the cycles and generals turn them into schedules, the old order kings aligning their actions with the sky to keep the world obedient remains. But the alignment is pressed into service for urgency rather than elegance. Some of this was always there. Even in the early classic, cities could wound each other in ways that took decades to heal. In 562, Caracol's defeat of Tikal ushered in a famous hiatus, a silence in Tikal's public voice that lasted lifetimes. Only in 695 did Jasa Chankawil II swing the pendulum back with a triumph over Calakmul that reads in stone like a long exhale. But the terminal classic, the hour when the last monuments fall quiet, adds something harsher: frequency, breadth, and the sense that war has slipped its leash and begun to eat the hand that held it. The Pitex Batun Basin in Guatemala bears the clearest scar. Dos Pilas rose in the 7th century as an offshoot of royal Tikal, founded under Alaj Chan Kawil, a prince who would ally with Calakmul when Tikal stumbled. From that betrayal or brilliance, depending on where you stood, a small empire briefly cohered, vassal towns cowed, rivals harried, a ring of power tightened by ambush and oath, but the circle became a snare. Counterattacks multiplied. Routes once safe grew teeth. Refugees tightened belts inside walls as the countryside turned predatory. At Aguateca, the last redoubt of that dynasty, excavation revealed a life interrupted, a feast half-eaten, tools left in place, a scribe's paint still wet when flight began. Punta de Chimino, once peninsula, was cut into an island by defensive ditches so sharp and deep they feel more like an idea than an earthwork break the land itself to keep the night at bay. Elsewhere, cities that had been planned for procession and display sprouted fortification like hurried hedgehogs. Tikal threw up ditches and embankments near sacred precincts. Copán, proud and intricate in its art, learned to scowl. Moats appear where they weren't imagined. Palisades rise where open causeways once invited pilgrim feet. Bican's famous earlier earthworks proof that the Maya could plan big defenses long before the crisis suddenly had company from sites that previously trusted in distance and diplomacy. The costs roll outward like ripples. When war is always possible, upfields are sometimes untended. A farmer called to shoulder a spear is a row of maize left to weeds. Trade, that net of obligations and favors strung between cities. Phrase, salt, from the northern salinas, the essential preservative and lifesaver in a climate that spoils meat as fast as it cooks. It doesn't always arrive. Obsidian flows, once steady from preferred sources, jitter and reroute. Blades grow coarser, toolkits look improvised. Elite goods follow the same pattern. A jade dwindles. Spondylus shell grows rare. Pigments with particular hues and tempers become merely red, blue, black, a palette shrinking toward necessity. And because classic Maya kingship stands on a promise, my blood and ritual hold the sky steady. My captives feed the covenant. Military failure becomes cosmic failure. A defeated Ajah is not just a general bested. He is a priest unmasked. His capture, displayed on a stone and in procession, tells every eye the same story. The gods have listened to someone else as defeats compound. Faith drains from the office, then from the plan. Local lords stiffen into independence. Allies hedge their bets. Vassals recalculate their future aloud. The armies themselves change. Once, nobles led small, terrifyingly brave bands aimed like knives at other nobles. Now, the musters look larger and hungrier. Commoners fight not as retainers at the edge of pageantry, but as the point of it. Wooden palisades, quick to erect and quicker to burn, define new front lines, traps, and ditches, stupefyingly simple, do work that glyphs never imagined they'd have to record. Arrow storms matter more. The intimate ballet of elite capture recedes. We find mass graves in late layers, skeletons not honored individually, but raked together by urgency, a communal burial that reads like exhaustion. Even ritual bows to logistics. War scheduled to Venus is still war scheduled. And when the omens and the granary conflict, someone gambles. Rulers seize rival irrigation works and reservoirs as if seizing altars. The glyph for taking cities, once a statement that one dynasty had taught another to behave, becomes the ledger line for controlling water. Siege. Always the patient killer. Steps to the center. The great reservoirs that once guaranteed seasons to come turn into mirrors of failure when the rains thin, as water shrinks, tempers sharpen. The city that holds the lost full synod holds the last word. On the edges of the southern lowlands, you can glimpse an alternate answer taking shape. Shebal in the Patient River region shows a late flowering under new hands, outsiders, with Gulf Coast ties and different masks, often called Putun or Chontal Maya in older books. Stellae shift style. Foreign elements enter the art with the confidence that suggests mercenary traders doubling as power brokers. For a heartbeat, the city's heart beats stronger under this imported rhythm, but the beat doesn't spread far enough or last long enough to reverse the tide. Meanwhile, in the north, new centers prove that adaptation is a form of truce. Chichén Itzá's columns suggest assemblies and troops drilled for a broader, more public politics. The cult of the feathered serpent coils around stairways, where shadow plays at equinox promise a spectacle to knit a wider crowd. Ports along the coast of Yucatan bristle with canoes as serious as any galley, heavy with salt, cotton, honey, and obsidian. The sea, which brings strangers and choices, becomes a second countryside. Even warfare there takes on a different texture. Control the inlet instead of the field. Hold the reef, not the ridge. Back south, the drumbeat narrows. City-states, once comfortable with a calendar's confidence, now live from season to season. The council house debates triage, hold the fortification and risk the harvest, or let the palisade rot and pray. The neighbor prefers to steal maize rather than heads. Runners go out with parchments wrapped in waxed cloth and come back with faces no one can read. The scribal class, the men and women whose hands made time permanent, shrinks or relocates. Painted codices become rarer. Monuments commissioned with the old eagerness, now look like last wills. When did the ritual end and the ravaging begin? There's no single hinge. The entrada of 378 that flipped the political logic at Tikal, a arrival from central Mexico that installed a new order, shows early how porous and therefore combustible the chessboard could be. The Tikal-Calakmul rivalry writes an epic of feint and counterfeint over centuries, but the last chapters crowd their lines. In the 8th and 9th centuries, the intervals shorten, the defeats cut deeper, the recoveries grow stubbier. The Chronicle's font gets a smaller to cram more in before the page runs out, and then one day, in a city we cannot name with certainty because its last stela never stood, a war leader turns to a king and says, "What no one wants to hear, we can fight and starve, or we can leave and live." The king, whose job is to translate the sky into safety, has no sky left to borrow authority from somewhere. A child asks why the Venus priests keep promising victory and the jars keep emptying somewhere else. Two neighbors who once greeted each other across a field now meet with spears, and a flinch both have learned too well. War, which once oiled the gears of kingship, has become sand. This is how political machines end, not with a single blow, but with beating faster than the body can bear. The Maya were superb at making meaning from cycles. Their wars obeyed those cycles for a long time. In the terminal classic, the meanings loosen. Venus still rises, but the men who time their courage to her find that courage cannot fill a reservoir, or bake more bread, or bring a son home from a palisade set aflame in a night rain. The last victories are local and temporary. The last defeats are general and durable. The king's blood spills on paper, the smoke curls, the serpent of vision rises, and no rain answers. In the silence that follows, the weapons grow quiet too, not because peace has returned, but because the city has learned an older truth than kingship. You cannot fight for a place that no longer feeds you. The rainforest looks inexhaustible until you try to live off it at scale. The classic Maya did, brilliantly, for centuries. They coaxed crops from thin tropical soils that surrendered their nutrients quickly. They stitched terraces along slopes and made gardens in swamps. They turned natural sinkholes and carved reservoirs into seasonal lungs for their cities. But the more people the land fed, the harder the bargain became. A civilization that measured time in aeons began to spend its future in decades. Start with the soil itself. Beneath the green lace of canopy lies dirt that is old and easily tired. In milpa plots, the rotational fields that sustained villages farmers cut, burned, planted maize, beans, and the squash, then left the ground to rest while forest regrew. With low populations and generous fallow, the cycle worked like a breath: inhale, exhale, replenish. As the cities swelled in the 700s, the breath shortened, fallow shrank, plots returned to the hoe sooner than the soil could heal, and the thin top layer, unprotected by tree roots, sloughed away in the first fierce rains. To buy time, the Maya engineered hillsides, put on stone terraces like rips to catch earth before it ran. In the Bejos, the seasonal swamps that pocked the lowlands, they cut canals and raised long beds so crops could ride above flood, then sip the remaining moisture when the sky turned stingy. Causeways and dams rechanneled water to places of need. Choltons, bottle-shaped cisterns carved into bedrock, waited under courtyards to nurse households between storms. In capitals like Tikal, and kalakmol. Vast plastered basins caught wet season downpours and dripped cool salvation month by month. None of this was naive. It was precise and hard-won, and yet the arithmetic kept tightening. More mouths, more stone, more wood, more fire. Fire is the hinge of the story. The city's white radiance temples and plazas in the blinding glare of noon was not the color of raw limestone alone. It was lime-plaster, stucco spread thick and smoothed like water, then painted. Lime is made by burning limestone hot enough to drive off carbon dioxide, leaving quicklime that hisses and hardens when slaked to keep a kiln near 900 degrees. You feed it a forest, every new coating on a pyramid, every resurfaced plaza, every gleaming mask of a god had a hidden price counted in cords of wood. Scholars today, running the numbers with a mason's stubbornness, estimate that mantle upon mantle of plaster required the felling of woodlands measured not in groves but in square miles. Multiply that across rival courts racing to outshine one another, and the hills around the cities begin. In the mind's eye, to go bare, wood did more than powder stone. It boiled meals, fired pottery, smelted the copper bells that would chime on a lord's belt. It framed roofs, fed kilns for lime and clay, and carried 1,000 smaller needs most records don't bother to name. When a city builds with a stone and feeds with maize, every cartload of fuel is a breath in the city's chest. As the ring of cleared land widened, the hall lengthened, so the breath cost more to draw. Evidence for this slow burning is not just common sense, it is layered in the lakes. Cores taken from Piétain basins read like barcodes for centuries. In the classic peak, tree pollen thins and the grains of weedia species. Those hardy colonizers of stumped fields surge, coarser sediments hilltops and terraces, washing away pile thick between quiet laminations. Charcoal flecks a spike in the record, not a single apocalypse, but the steady signature of fields and kilns and kitchens, pulling heat from wood that no longer grows back as fast as a city needs. Even the chemistry of the mud changes, magnetic minerals and eroded clays rising with every season that the canopy fails to hold its ground. Strip away trees and the land forgets how to drink. The forest's grip on water is not just shade, it is a pump. Leaves lift moisture back to the sky. Roots stitch soil and slow rains assault. Without that living machinery, downpours turn violent, sheeting off slopes into sudden brown floods, gouging gullies where paths used to be, leaving fields scabbed and sullen. In the dry months, the changed ground bakes, streams shrink, the air holds less humidity to feed afternoon storms. On the hottest days, even the plaza's hard white faces glare back heat like insult. The harm traveled quiet routes too, when hillsides loosened, reservoirs silted, their careful plastered bottoms buried under a film of fine, choking earth. The very systems meant to buy time, those grand basins that held off thirst, lost volume little by little until their margins crept inward like a fearful animal. Canals needed dredging more often. Crews that might have terraced new ground were kept busy rescuing old. Maintenance ate ambition. In the countryside, the daily ledger of a house turned mean. A woman walks farther for fuel. A child's small feet pad longer and return with lighter bundles. Hunters range wider and bring back less as understory thins and game grows scarce. The household medicine cabinet shrinks fewer barks, fewer leaves because those plants grew where canopy and shade did. When a baby spikes a fever, the remedy the grandmother would have gathered in an hour now takes a day, or doesn't come at all. These are not grand disasters, they are the million irritants that make a culture tender to the touch. None of this unfolded in ignorance. The Maya knew trees. They planted ramon near house lots for dependable nuts, tended cacao in shade gardens, coppiced the species that return after cutting. Some cities show careful succession in their botanical record managed mosaics of forest, orchard, and field. But management has limits when population curves climb and politics turn architecture into theater. A new king's accession cries out for a new facade. A victory asks for a paved processional way. A god demands a mask replastered until it gleams. Craft pride answers, kilns rise, men sweat by fires that make the night look like day. Over time, even the best-run hinterland becomes a belt of compromise. The earth itself tells this story in miniature at abandoned sites. Excavations peel back plaza floors to reveal layer upon layer of resurfacing 3 inches, then 5, then a hand's span of fresh stucco each, a festival trapped under the next. Along causeways, the Saskab fill the crushed limestone that made hard paths spills into ditches like sifted bone. Where terraces once held, collapses show in tilted stones and fans of soil slid downslope and caught years later by a newer, lower wall, a staircase of capitulation. On one terrace, you find maize grains charred where a kitchen burned. On the next, a kiln for lime. On the third, a rubbish pit full of ash and bones too small to be dear. If you stand on a cleared ridge at dusk, one of those places where archaeologists cut a window through second growth, you can feel the geometry behind the grief. The city below needs water and food and sacred shine. To provide them, you clear land, which steals soil and coolness. To hide that theft, you build finer, which spends more wood. To feed that building, you clear more land. It is not a circle so much as a spiral, each turn drawing you closer to a point where any drought, any war, any insult from chance delivers double pain. And yet the Maya were not reckless. They kept calendars of rain, recorded auspicious days for planting and burning, timed a slash and burn to seasons when regrowth would be quickest. Their priests watched for Venus not only to schedule war, but to warn farmers when the year's rhythm would be estranged. They improved storage jars and reworked reservoir lips. They taught children the old paths to springs and the ways to read a tree's leaves for the health of the ground. 1,000 local competencies, things never written in glyphs or painted on palace walls pushed against the slide for generations. Those hands held, but scale erodes a skill. A city of 10,000 can live on ingenuity. A city of 50,000 lives on system. A city pushing beyond that must borrow from tomorrow. When rival courts watched one another, the spur of prestige made prudence feel like defeat. If your neighbor's pyramid shines brighter, your god looks small. If your plaza is patched but not renewed, your people mutter, the result is not villainy, it is momentum. The lake bottoms keep their cool counsel. In core after core, the pollen of forest trees wanes while grasses and the scrub take their place. Detrital influx rises, the signal for fire grows thick. In some basins, the shift comes in pulses, an initial clearing, a breath, a harder push, a plateau of maintenance, and then the final surge as populations peak and every available acre is forced to produce. After that crest, the record changes again, charcoal falling off, tree pollen returning, but not because management improved. The people are gone. The forest comes back the way it always does, patient, opportunistic, indomitable. In the short view, deforestation steals wood, soil, and shade. In the long view, it steals resilience, a society that has trimmed away its buffer, its ability to miss a rain or lose a harvest, and a still stand becomes exquisitely sensitive to chance. One bad season pinches, two deform, three break. The classic Maya built tools to soften fate, and for centuries those tools worked. By the late 8th century, the tools themselves needed tools. Every adaptation required more labor than the last. When the sky chose cruelty, there was no slack left in the rope. That sky is the next chapter, not an omen carved in jade, but the chemistry of caves and lakes, spelling out dry years stacked into dry decades. Before we look up to read that sentence, sit a moment with the ground, the king's promised order, and for a long time they delivered it by turning forest into time bought for rituals, time bought for rule. When the bill came due, it did not break in with a crash. It arrived as a shortage, then another, and then a season when the kiln yard was quiet because there was nothing left close enough to burn. Look up. After generations of bargaining with earth and wood, the next line of the story is written in air and cloud. The Maya were a people in covenant with rain. Their calendars turned on it. Their reservoirs waited for it. Their kings bled to call it. For centuries, the sky kept faith. Then, in the late 8th century, it began to answer more slowly than not at all. How do we know what the sky did when no one alive remembers? The evidence is not in chronicles, but in archives the earth wrote without us. In the Yucatan, shallow lakes hold a quiet ledger at the bottom, a sheet of mud written one layer per year. Cores drawn from those beds rise to the surface like rolled carpets from a dark room. Slice the cylinder and you see the years stacked thin bands laid down by calm seasons. Thick, coarse tongues from storms. Faint glitter when dust blew hard. A white, sugary seam when water shrank and minerals crystallized out. In dry years, gypsum grows. Its presence is a chemical sigh. Less rain fell. Evaporation outpaced the sky's charity. Water concentrated, and the lake precipitated its complaint in crystals. Red band after band, and a pattern emerges, pulses of desiccation, marching through the very window of time when Maya monuments fall silent. Beneath the low limestone hills, another archive grew, a stalwart and a slow, in caves where the air waits and the dark is complete. Stalagmites rise by drops. Each drip carries the sky's signature inside it, oxygen isotopes nudged by cloud paths and sea temperatures, by rainfall's generosity or stinginess. Layer after limestone layer, a stone tree records the balance of wet and dry. When analysts shave those layers thin and listen with instruments, they hear the rhythm of centuries, a long, wet grace that nurtured classic growth, followed by a faltering beat, then long dry notes stacked into decades of scarcity. Two records, lake and cave, composed separately by water and time, hum the same melody of want. The timeline is cruelly neat. The Maya fluorescence from the 3rd through the 6th centuries coincides with a stretch after a stretch of steady rain. Population swelled, reservoirs brimmed, terraces greened, Courts competed in architecture that gleamed with new lime. Then, around 750, the lake chemistries turn sour. The cave layers lean toward the heavy isotopes that attend drought. Not a single failed season farmers know how to survive that, but a sequence bad years nested inside bad decades. Dry spells returning before the land had recovered. A series of mega droughts whose stubbornness outlasted patience and ritual alike. Take that signal out of the lab and into a city. In Tikal, plastered catchments the size of city blocks waited for the deluge. Their lips led rain into basins lined like bowls with gleaming stucco. As seasons turned niggardly, those bowls lowered their line of wet and cracked in the sun. Silt, already a problem from hills stripped for fuel, settled faster in a slow, shallow water, stealing volume like a thief who prefers pennies to gold. Where reservoirs lingered, their quality declined. Warm, still basins bloom. Water goes turbid. A desert in the sky breeds a different kind of hazard in the cup. Households with a jar to draw might hesitate at the lip. The surface greened by life that thrives when flow stops. In the countryside, maize stalks did what they always do first when the sky withholds, they curled. Tassels browned before they dusted, ears set, small or not at all. Families hedged the way their grandparents taught them, ramon nuts stored in baskets, tubers pulled from ground that keeps secrets, beans coaxed from plots that still remember shade, but a city cannot live on hedges. When rains faltered again the next year and the one after, the margin shrank to a line. Hunger is not dramatic at first. Children go quiet. Tasks that took one morning take two. Old injuries complain, tempers shorten at dusk. Then the thinness becomes sharp. Skeletons from late classic cemeteries carry the record in their own tissue enamel, disrupted in childhood by stress. Bones stopped short in a stature. Chemical hints in dentine that diets became even more maize-heavy as options died back. The drought picked favorites that already mattered. Springs hold longer than reservoirs. Sinkholes, shaded by thick forest, give sips when catchments inside cities lie still as bone. That made water into politics. Fortifications thrown up at the end of the classic are often where a spring or a reliable seep sits just outside a ceremonial core. Walls that would not have been worth the lime a century earlier became the difference between a city that could go on and one that could not. Routes that once carried salt and obsidian carried water-skin caravans and the men to guard them. Old rivalries found new excuses. New rivalries were born in the dust where water once ran. Ritual met this sky with everything it had. Kings intensified the pageant of petition. Bloodletting grew more frequent and more public. Incense, thickened in sanctuaries, made brighter with fresh paint that cost dear wood to make. Priests climbed observatory stairs to scan Venus and the moon for signs that could be turned into hope. Processions that once felt ample became urgent. A court's musicians learned hymns in lower keys to suit the hour. But the covenant at the center of kingship frayed each time the clouds formed and then broke apart over a thirsty city. A ruler's first job was to hold the world in order to stand inside the mechanism of time and make sure the teeth meshed. When the gears slipped visibly, empty reservoirs below. A merciless sky above the logic that bound subjects to throne strain. Warfare had been part of the system for centuries, a ritual economy of capture and display. Drought stripped away restraint. When your reservoir is low and your neighbor's spring still sinks. A raid is not theology, it is arithmetic. The murals that turned savage late, crowded with soldiers behind palisades. Captives in rows can be read as weather as much as ambition. A hungry army fights meaner and burns wider. Fields near a frontier go unweeded when men stand watch. Terraces break under neglect. Smoke from defensive fires rises into a sky that needed trees instead. Famine and fighting braided until it was impossible to know which thread cut deeper. There were local successes, some communities, luckier with geology or more conservative with woodland, endured long into the dry century, in places where hydrology favored deep wells or where lakes are fed by underground rivers. The line held. Farmers who had inherited knowledge of drought-tolerant plots scraped down pockets where thin soil dries fast but also warms early, found small consistencies to stitch seasons together, but geography's charity was not evenly sent, and the political map did not match the water map. A proud capital, perched high and dry, could suffer, while a lesser town in limestone's broken edge drank. That inversion made mess of hierarchies built over generations. Drought also slowed time in another way. Construction campaigns jerked, then stopped. The unfinished plazas that archaeologists find the half-paved expanses. The staircases that become ramps of rough fill speak climate as much as conflict. Work crews cannot keep lime burning when wood is a day farther. Masons do not finesse a molding when their wages buy less food each month. A ruler postpones the terrace repair season because a spearman must camp by a spring. The visible city is a barometer where plaster stops freshening. Water has stopped coming. All of this, the cores and crystals, the isotopes and silt, the cracked stucco. The bent stalks adds up to a prosecution brief against chance and the inertia of success. It is not that the Maya lacked intelligence or foresight. They had more of both than any people has a right to claim calendars accurate enough to predict eclipses, records of rains written in a stone, hydraulic works that moved water like thought. Their long competence made their world taut. Like a drum tuned high, drought did not strike a single blow. It tapped and tapped until a skin tore. Imagine the sound inside a city as the last great basin dried. The slap of sandals on hot plaster goes hollow. Amphorae, heavy when full, are light enough to carry two at a time. The usual morning market mutter is thin. Salt sells dear. A woman barters a carved comb for a sack of squash that tastes of dust. A priest passes with a bowl of copal, eyes rimmed red from smoke and sleeplessness, on the temple's steps. A scribe who has carved dates all his life looks up at a sky that refuses to be counted and, for the first time, cannot think of which glyph to trace next. The lakes and caves tell us what the sky did. The cities tell us what people had to do in answer. The drought is not the whole story. War and wood chop and the soil loss were already at work, but it is the force that braided those threads into a rope and pulled in the next breath of the tail. That pull becomes motion families choosing to leave, courts going quiet, the long withdrawal into smaller places where rain still remembers how to fall. For now, let the cave cool your cheek and the lake's mud stain your hand. The sky's unspoken sentence has been read aloud. When the sky forgets you long enough, people begin to unspool. The first threads to loosen were small habits lost at the edges of the day. a field untended after a skirmish, a canal left clogged one season too many, a plaster cistern patched with earth instead of lime because wood was dear, and lime dearer. These are the little treasons by which a system tells you it's tired. Then the larger betrayals came into view. The king's rites grew more elaborate as the rains grew less so. Incense throbbed through sanctuaries where water jars sat light and accusatory on their shelves. A priest lifted a bowl of blood toward a sky that did not blink. The crowd below felt the first hairline crack in a conviction older than their grandfathers. Cities that had once performed confidence began to fortify. At Tikal and elsewhere, archaeologists find rings of hurried earth and timber ditches, palisades, earthen ramparts thrown up inches from the sacred core as if a palace could be saved by the distance a javelin must fly, inscriptions, proud with verbs for capture and accession, dwindle and then stop. Workshops that once turned out painted bowls as thin as eggshells settle for thicker. Duller ware, the glazes muddy, the hands that made them fewer. Trade routes that had braided kingdoms together fray obsidian blades arrive chipped. Salt comes late, cacao traders begin to travel with extra men and asleep with one eye open. The sack biop, the raised white roads that stitched city to city, kept their pale gleam in the moonlight for a while, and then footprints grew sparse. Hunger makes a harsh arithmetic of loyalty. When a reservoir is brown at the bottom and the temple asks for labor to raise a new stair, a household learns the weight of refusal. Some still answered the summons. Habit is strong, and fear stronger, but others drifted to outlying hamlets where a spring persisted in shade. The unfinished works that litter the late classic are not just civic failures, they are absences with names masons who left to find work where water ran, carriers who could not spare the calories to haul one more dressed a stone, overseers who sat with tally sticks and realized that no count would fill the cruise. You can see them still in the half-laid plaza, the staircase that breaks off into rubble, the causeway that fades into brush like a sentence abandoned mid-clause. War rose to match the drought. It had always been there, ritualized and fierce, a grammar of capture and ransom and display. The new wars were hungrier. Fortified hilltops sprouted palisades, ditches cut across approaches like scars, stockades paled the hands that built them. Bonampac's murals, once studied for their brilliance alone, read now like weather panic in the crowding figures, the grim patience of men binding captives in rows, the backstage cruelty that follows public victory. Excavations at some late sites uncover mass graves with cut marks where none should be. A tangle of lives ended not at an altar's measured pace, but in the rush of a breach. When fields turn into front lines and front lines into fields of corpses, seed goes unplanted. War was not the cause alone, but it was the amplifier. Inside the courts, calendars kept their poise even as the rooms thinned. Scribes could still count to the day, could still set the long count in a stone with a precision that makes modern readers smile with awe. But the dates stopped being commissioned. The last fitted glyph for a last ceremony. And then silence a hush so loud it is the loudest thing the classic world left behind. In that hush, a political theology failed in public. A king could still bleed for the gods, he could not any longer guarantee rain. He could still stage a procession. He could not fill a jar. The bond between people and throne had been a bargain tribute, and labor upward, favor and cosmic order downward. The first half continued, while the second evaporated. Bonds become ropes when only one side holds. Imagine one household at the edge of a city when the bargain breaks. The house posts smell of smoke. The child's growth scratches are notched in the doorway. Their milpa small. Beloved has bent early 2 seasons running. The reservoir at the plaza has dropped until the plaster shows a faint ring like an old bruise. The husband has stood night watch twice this month along a half-dug trench. The wife has traded a jade bead for a sack of maize that tasted of mold. The king's men came yesterday with a list of names for roofing crews. The boy has started to cough when the dust rises at noon. Somewhere between dusk and dawn, a decision blooms in the dark. Before first light, they pack rope, a gourd, a few tools wrapped in cloth, a pot that has survived a dozen fires. They touch the lintel, a quiet apology to ancestors, and step away. Their feet know the small paths that avoid patrols. They join a trickle that has been flowing for years and will, by slow accumulation, empty a city. This vote with the feet shows up in the archaeology with a tenderness that hurts. In some centers, commoners move briefly into palaces, setting hearths on floors that once gleamed, smoke blackening frescoes where gods danced. They patch roofs with whatever can be had. A generation later, there are ash lenses where feasts used to roar. Broken spindle whorls where scribes once kept reed pens. And then even the squatters are gone. The jungle takes the hint. Seeds find seams. Roots worry at the backs of stones. A staircase sag becomes a ramp for the first fig. A lintel rots, and water comes in stronger, and a wall slumps with a sound like breath leaving. The ball court, which once rang with shouts, grows a tall grass. The court's goals frame nothing now but sky. The countryside keeps some of what the city forgot. Not every lineage dissolves, not every rite is abandoned. Smaller communities learn to live with less spectacle and more caution. They plant where there is shade at noon, dig shallow wells where limestone fractures, store what they can in ceramic jars sealed with wax and prayer. They measure time more by the feel of wind than by carved counts. They teach children patterns for weaving that outlast the names of kings. Trade contracts fragment into neighborly exchanges. When a child asks what stands beyond the ridge, the answer shrinks to a place where water runs and a cousin lives. The horizon draws inward until it fits hand and habit. If a city lingered in a favorable fold of a stone near a wet cave, above a reliable spring, it might taper rather than snap. Courtyards narrowed, elite compounds blended into ordinary blocks. The distance between ruler and ruled closed, not by reform, but by necessity. Inscriptions, where they continued, grew local in mind and hope. A dedication here, a plea there, less thunder and more weather report. We are still here. We marked a day. The gods remember. Elsewhere, houses fold like tents after a festival. Refuse bowls fill with the last bones. Small fish scraped from shrinking waters. Turtles caught in a few good months and then not seen again. The exodus, multiplied across hundreds of valleys and dozens of courts, did not look like a single march. It was 100,000 small gestures, the pot cached in a wall niche, the spindle left leaning, the hearth raked out for a last time. It culminated, For outsiders looking in centuries later, in a miracle of error, forest over temple, birds over plaza, a city erased into a hill. But for those living it, the miracle was survival. They moved to where the sky still remembered them. They took with them maize seed saved in gourds, songs that keep planting company, stories about the old capitals which, repeated enough, turn into legend that remembers in a blur. They did not vanish. They changed address and scaled their lives to a climate that had made extravagance unpayable. In the vacuum, the court left. Others adapted differently. In the north, on the drier Yucatan, cities would learn to lean on the sea. They would turn canoes into caravans and trade wind into ally. But that is the next chapter. Here, in the south, the long, slow going out becomes complete. A late scribe chisels the last date he will ever cut. He lifts his hand and feels the stone cool under the shade of a tree that was not there when he began. He writes no epitaph. He does not need to. The plaza's new grass and the silence after dusk say enough. The city, which once moved to drums and dates, begins its long conversation with leaf and root, and the people, lighter by what they have put down, learn the roads of the forest again. When the southern forests tightened their fist around a stone, the north turned its face to salt wind. The Yucatan is flatter, drier, a hammered anvil of limestone with no rivers on the surface water held in the earth's blue throat cenotes. Here, in the centuries when the southern capitals dimmed, a new constellation brightened cities that made a virtue of scarcity and the habit of looking outward. They did not inherit the South's green abundance. They invented an economy that breathed with the sea. The greatest of these was Chichén Itzá, a name that tastes of water at the mouth of the well of the Itzá. If you walked there in its height, you would have felt a different temper from the old lowland courts. The sacred precinct is ordered like a thought, broad plazas, straight causeways, buildings speaking to one another across space. El Castillo rises in the middle, a temple pyramid that is also a calendar you can climb. 91 steps on each face and one for the top platform. 365 in all, and on the equinox afternoons, a notched shadow slides down the stair to join the serpent's stone head at the base. The sky writes on the pyramid. The city reads and applauds. Around it stand the temple of the warriors, a forest of columns once shouldering wooden roofs, and chacmuls reclining stone messengers with bowls held on their stomachs waiting for offerings. The great ball court stretches vast and baffling. Its walls are so high that the rubber ball must have flown like a prayer. Panels show victors and the strange, cool logic of the game sacrifice as privilege, blood as seed. There's beauty here, and also steel. The art grows sharper, the warriors more explicit. Feathers and jaguar pelts keep company with atlatls and sepirs. It remains Maya, but it has learned new costumes and postures from the West, hints of distant Tula carried on the backs of ideas and traders. Chichén was not alone. To the west, Uxmal rose from the Puc Hills in a style that looks like lace cut in the stone-long palaces with facades stippled and woven by small, squared mosaic pieces. Rain god masks stacked like clouds along the corners, their hooked noses repeating into rhythm. At Kaaba and Sayal, buildings perch like thoughtful animals along ridges, stairways heavy with light. These Puc cities solved the water problem with engineering, not faith alone, thousands of chultans, bottle-shaped cisterns, plastered smooth-caught rain from carefully paved aprons and roof drains. In a land without rivers, you make your own. But the North's real genius was a road. You cannot pave a maritime belt that ran the edges of the peninsula like a thumb on a bowl rim. From salt flats in the north and west to honeyed lowlands and cotton fields inland, to port islands on the east where clear water deepens to blue. Goods flowed into canoes and out to sea. The canoes themselves were long and strong, dug from single great logs, sometimes broad enough to carry families, cargo, and a small forest of paddles. Early European sailors would blink to see them 50 men at the oars, a captain with a steering paddle as tall as he was, merchants under a palm mat canopy guarding cacao, cotton mantles, copper bells, obsidian blades that flashed green in the sun, and gourds sloshing with fermented honey drink. Ports appeared like beads on a string Isla Caritos, a coral nub at the end of a causeway serving as Chichén's custom house, Zilha and Iscaret Pole, good landings on the east where reefs break the sea's appetite, Cozumel, sacred to the goddess of childbirth and weaving, where pilgrims crossed bright water to leave offerings and buy what traders offered. Farther south, Tulum leaned over the surf like a watchman, its cliff-top temple, a lighthouse of faith and power. Salt was the quiet king of these coasts, harvested from pink flats and packed into blocks that moved like currency. Cotton cloth, fine and sturdy, stitched value into bales. Honey from stingless bees kept in hollow logs, handled by keepers who knew their hum, like a lullaby, sweetened trade and medicine. Obsidian came down the old highland routes. Jade still gleamed from beloved sources, while new things arrived, two small copper ornaments, a bell's thin music, ideas hammered thin and shiny. This turn seaward did not abandon the sacred, it reframed it. The sacred note at Chichén Itzá yawns like a green eye in the earth, its walls busy with vines. Here, offerings went down into cool silence jade, gold that came by many hands to a land without its own, turbans and textiles, copal resin, perhaps, in bad years, a human life. Men dredged it centuries later and found a museum of faith at the bottom, a record of what the city thought the gods would fancy. Elsewhere, the old rites wore new costumes. Rain was still the most eloquent of deities, and his mask multiplied along cornices as if repetition itself could invite a storm. Politically, the North learned a softer grip than the South's old superpowers had managed. Chronicles remember a league Chichén Itzá, Mayapan, Uxmal cooperating and competing in turn. As leagues do, Mayapan, walled and wary, would eventually pull ahead, then fall in a civil tear that scattered lords and their retinues like starlings. But for a long, brilliant interval, the system worked, cities specialized. Ports linked specialties into routes, and risk spread out across water and time. A drought in one district could be cushioned by stores moving in hulls from another. When rain failed, canoes did not. This was environmental pragmatism disguised as commerce. Walk a market in this era with unhurried eyes. A woman runs cotton between her fingers, judges the weave by feel alone. A salt cellar tips a block to show its clean break. A priest in simple white inspects a carved shell pendant, turns it once, twice, listens to a price as if to an omen. Children run errands, dogs find shade. A trader from the west outlines with a stick on hard-packed earth how long it takes to reach his home harbor with a following sea. Nearby, a carpenter leans on a canoe rib and watches the water. It will add one more thwart if the owner continues to brag about how much he means to carry. Knowledge is currency too, and everywhere the angle of a roof in hurricane months, how to seal a Trulton's plaster against the taste of limestone, the way to read reefs by the color of water before your paddle hits coral. The North's art answers to this mood. Murals show merchants as proudly as lords. The feathered serpent undulates not just across temple steps, but through stories about movement and return. The gods keep their fierceness, but their domains widen. A storm deity smiles from a ship's painted prow. A maize god raises a hand over a weighing of cloth. The calendar continues to tick, eclipses predicted. Venus watched, yet time feels less like command than collaboration. People still looked up, but they looked outward more. There were, always, shadows. Power concentrates even in open systems. Chichén's dominance minted winners and losers. Mayapan's later rise brought walls and suspicion back to the center. Leagues break as easily as they form, and the sea that gives can take. Storms bully coasts. Reefs are unforgiving to prideful pilots, and pirates are a weed that grows wherever profit does. But the structural wisdom endures. Diversify routes, modularize risk, store water close to home, and do not trust any single bargain with the sky. It is tempting to draw a clean moral line south inward, north outward, south drought torn, north drought proof. The truth is less smug. Northern cities also felt ilks of dry years. They also bent under quarrels that turned lethal. They too would know decline and sudden flight. Yet for a while, their design bought time to turn sacred geography into hydraulic engineering, to turn isolation into harbors, to turn scarcity into exchange. And while scribes elsewhere were laying down their last dates, northern hands kept writing, carving the names of lords and merchants into lintels and the stairways with a confidence that, if not eternal, at least spanned a few more grandparents. At dusk, when wind eases and the sea glows like hammered tin, you can stand at Tulum's cliff and watch a line of canoes come in. First the scouts, slim and quick, then the heavier hulls, paddles rising and falling in a learned fatigue. On shore, fires catch, fish hiss, salt stiff cloth softens in steam. Somewhere in the town, a girl counts the days on a cord knot by knot, and a boy learns to hear the difference between the scrape of paddle on gunwale and the warning whisper of reef. The stars come out and name the lanes. In the morning, the canoes will nose out again. The feathered serpent will unspool his shadow down a stair on the right day, and water stored underground will taste like foresight. The classic world did not end everywhere at once, and in the north it turned into something seaworthy, a culture that could trade hunger in one place for fullness in another, that could braid rain and salt into the same rope. The people had learned not to tame the sky, but to be less alone beneath it. The northern cities burned bright, then flickered. Mayapan walled, watchful, governed by councils more than by a single radiant lord, rose as the last great capital, and then tore itself apart around the mid-15th century. Factions snapped, lineages scattered. The peninsula fell back into a mosaic of petty polities and coastal towns, each with its harbor, its patron gods, its rhythms of feast and trade. The sea kept the routes open. The Chinooks kept the faith. It might have gone on like that for centuries, small estates. Wide horizons if, one season, sails like cliffs had not appeared on the line where the sky touches water. The strangers came asking for gold and baptisms, bringing iron that held an edge past sunset, animals that snorted fog, and a book that said the world must look another way. They had first stumbled onto Maya canoes at sea, astonished to see hulls as long as theirs, heaped with cotton and cacao, paddled by men who knew currents like they knew kin. Soon they turned their prows toward the ports. Cozumel received them with caution and offerings. Coastal towns parleyed. Disease slipped ashore without parleying with anyone. In the highlands to the south, a different front opened. Armies climbed toward the Quiche and Kachikal capitals, where lords wore cloaks like storms and counted tribute in cacao, beans, and salt. The fire weapons cracked open the air. Alliances shifted under boots. Cities that had stood since old stories frayed, fought, and fell. The conquest of the Yucatan itself was a long grind, more negotiation than charge, more hunger than glory. Towns yielded and rose again. Lineages signed and withdrew their names. Friars learned words quickly so they could say them more softly. Even after banners changed on plazas, one kingdom held out like a star. You can see only in the corner of your eye the Itzá at Nogpeten, an island city on a lake that kept its secrets. Traders still went by under pretense of other business. Rumor said the old gods there ate incense hot and sweet and answered. Only in 1697 did foreign cannon finally speak across the water, and the last court went under like a canoe that takes one wave too many. If this were only a story of fall, it would end there, but people are not capitals. The villages did what they had always done. When cities failed them, they turned inward and learned to breathe smaller. The milpa cornfield held the plan. Burn a patch at the right moon, plant maize, beans, squash in a companionship older than any war, rest the land and move in a patient circle that feeds a soil as it feeds children. Water still came out of the earth in blue stone mouths. Prayers still climbed with copal smoke. The names of gods shifted like masks. Santo Tomás looked very much like a lord of rain if you watched him out of the corner of your eye, but the request was the same: let the stalks rise, let the child live, let our dead remember the way home. Friars brought letters, and with them a grief. One of them, appalled and convinced he was saving souls, gathered books in a plaza at Meni and burned the painted deer hide codices until the day smelled like glue and loss. He would later write an account so detailed it became, against his intent, a bridge back to the people he had shamed. 4 codices slipped the fire kept in places that had no business knowing their names, and when the old script was rekindled in modern hands, those books were coals. Meanwhile, other words took root. A learned man sat with Quiche's elders and wrote down a long, quiet thunder, a story of creation and twins who trick lords of death, of a world made and remade. He wrote it in the people's language with a borrowed alphabet, and a scribe in a back room kept a second copy because he knew how time breaks things. Some towns embraced new fraternities, cofradías, where laymen took turns holding a saint's feast, paying from their own pockets to buy candles and music. It looked like a Spanish custom. It worked like Maya rotation and reciprocity. Daykeepers in the highlands, a Jakey job, kept count on the sacred calendar with kernels of maize and breath, reading the weft of days for births and plantings and marriages, saying out loud the old intervals in a new age. In the lowlands, Hanal Piksan, food for souls, set tables for ancestors. When the gates were thin between worlds, in each bowl of atole and on each plate of bread lay a grammar of love older than conquest. There were tempests in the 19th century when new governments pressed too hard on land and dignity. Towns in the east of the Yucatan rose and held their ground in a war that lasted a generation and more. They fought under a talking cross, a voice in wood that said God was listening from their side of the altar. For decades, the map broke. An independent Maya state pulsed in the forest, collecting taxes, issuing orders, tending fields, burying dead. Only when the outside world shifted again, rails, guns, commerce like a tide, did that stubborn country fade into the forest's green grammar. The lesson remained: a people that knows its own size can be very hard to erase. Today, the descendants of scribes and farmers number in the millions across the old lands. Children learned Spanish in school and their grandparents' vowels around a cook fire. 30 tongues and more braid the peninsula and the highlands, Yucatec and Quiche, Cacchical and Cuechi, Mam and Tzeltal, each with its own music, each with weather words no conqueror ever fully learned. Women sit at looms with patterns taught by mothers and dreams. The cloth they produce is both clothing and memory diamonds for the four corners, a zigzag for lightning, stepped frets that say mountain even when worn in a market by the sea. Men walk out at dawn with machetes bright and come back at dusk with the day's green on their boots. In some houses, there is a cell phone on the table and a gourd of atole beside it. Two technologies that do the same work keep families in touch with what matters. Pilgrimage never stopped. It changed roads. Cozumel still hears prayers, some in swimsuits now, some in hush. Chichén still pulls crowds for the serpent of shadow that slides the stairs. Small shrines at crossroads keep offerings of flowers and a few coins and the thread of murmured thanks. In churchyards, marimbas knock out bright songs while saints in niches wear cloths woven by hands that remember other gods. A boy lights a candle and does not care what the theology says if the fire gives his intention a shape. Archaeologists came back with better questions and gentler boots. They read the old stones with the help of elders who knew where not to step. And together they measured time backward and forward, the long count that names creation, and the short count that names when to plant, and the paragraph that explains why a stair was built at a particular slope so the equinox could write its signature. In museums, the rescued codices lie under glass-like nightfish, fragile and full of glint. In homes, grandmothers keep weather in their wrists and advise against planting on the day that feels wrong. No matter what the forecast says, the survival is not romance. Migration thins villages. Drought still comes lean. Companies buy water rights and men go to cities to send money down the wire like a river that runs uphill. Languages chip at their edges under the teeth of new economies. Customs hide in plain sight to avoid being laughed at. Yet resilience has its own liturgy. Teach a child to say maize in the tongue her great-grandfather used. Walk the field in the morning and greet the plants. Hold a feast for the dead with their favorite foods. Carry a saint with brown hands that look like your own around the plaza while the band plays a tune that remembers both processions and dances. These are not quaint. They are the daily engineering of endurance. If you stand at a village edge toward evening, you can hear the continuity better than you can see it. Dogs negotiate a pecking order with Frank. Brief violence. A rooster argues with the moon. A radio carries a cumbia past a fence. A grandmother calls a child in a language that shares bones with the glyphs carved 13 centuries ago, far off. On the highway, trucks mutter. Overhead, the Milky Way throws its old net. In a field nearby, a man fingers seed corn and decides to wait one more day. The air feels wrong for planting. He could be mistaken. He could also be participating in the oldest science his people ever practiced: observation, patience, respect for cycles bigger than any king. History loves cathedrals and coronations, collapses and the morning after. But most of what lasts in a civilization is a low-sound kasha, as a tortilla inflates over a komal, the sigh a loom makes when it accepts the shuttle, the hush a chenote keeps at noon when even the birds think. The Maya world did not end. It shed skins. It learned to live under new weather and new orders, masking and unmasking as needed, keeping steady the few truths that make the rest survivable. Water is sacred because you die without it. Time is a fabric you can learn to handle well or badly. Corn is a companion, not a commodity. Your dead are not gone if you feed them and say their names. And so, when we speak of survival, we do not mean a stubbornness alone. We mean a style and art of continuing. Cities rose and fell, gods changed hats. Maps were redrawn by men who didn't know the taste of Ramon fruit. Yet a child in the highlands ties a string around her wrist in the color the daykeeper recommends. And a fisherman on the Caribbean coast checks the color of the water to read the reef like his grandfather did. And a scribe in a city far from the jungle teaches himself to hear the old script breathe again, and finds that the words sound like people rather than myths. This is continuity, not a wall without cracks, but a pot that has been mended and still holds water, and when the light is right, shows its gold seams. If the southern forests had swallowed the cities, it was paper, ink, and patience that would coax their voices back. The 19th century had already peeled away vines with machetes and wonder. The 20th learned to read. It began with a paradox. A friar who burned books also preserved a key. Diego de Landa, zealous and remorseful in turns, wrote a long account of Yucatan and, thinking in alphabets, asked his Maya informants for letters. What they gave him were sounds matched to signs, a muddled, precious roster that would lie quiet for centuries, like a seed in a clay jar. Scholars copied it, argued over it, and then, mostly, returned to admiring the carvings as art, not speech. A great authority declared the glyphs were clouds of sacred time, not sentences about people. For a while, the stones stayed silent because experts insisted they should be. Silence rarely has the last word. In a small Soviet room after a hard war, a young linguist named Yuri studied photographs and Landa's awkward alphabet. He did the unromantic thing. He treated the signs like writing, not pictures alone, but a system that could sound. He showed how signs could stand for syllables and whole words at once, how they snapped together like shells on a string to make names. He wrote his argument out in careful prose and sent it west. The West, mostly, shrugged yet a door had creaked. A few years later, a different mind found a different handle, an architect with a draftsman's eye. Tatiana traced dates on a stelae at Piedras Negra and saw a human shape in the pattern birth, ascent, death, spans that fit a life. These were not calendars alone, they were biographies, names clustered with titles. Verbs lifted their heads like birds in the glyph blocks. The sculptures were history, not cosmic wallpaper. Once she said it out loud, others could not unhear it. The puzzle pieces began to ask to be joined. What followed felt less like a single triumph than like a long harvest. Epigraphers and archaeologists shared notebooks and mistakes. Artists and linguists taught one another to see. A generation gathered at Palenque and Copán and Tikal, turning rubbings and photographs into pronunciations, pronunciations into meanings, meanings into stories that sounded like something people would actually say. A boy, barely a teenager when he started, sketched a sign in the margin of a conference program and proposed a value that would later prove right. A woman mapped a palace and found politics in the plaster. The work advanced in pencil and in laughter, over camp tables and in rooms where someone had set coffee to keep warm through midnight. The cities began to speak their names, Yuknom Chi'in, Kienich, Janab, Pakal, syllable by syllable, a hum rising from stone. Names carried places with them. Dynasties unspooled like river lines. Copán's long roster set in order on an altar carved on all four faces. Each lord perched cross-legged above a glyph for his name, the first one a foreigner adopted and adored. Tikal and Calakmul facing one another like jaguars across a generation, their alliances radiating out like a spokes. Dos Pilas cutting neighbors and then cut, fleeing through the forest. The old murals at Bonampak, once just color and shock, now had captions that bit the day named. The captives titled, "The victory claimed for a lord whose cloth still hangs in shreds on the walls." The ball game stones called out rules and wagers. Vases whispered court gossip around scenes of gods drinking chocolate and lords doing the same. Reading the stones changed the map, and new maps changed the questions, from planes and then from small aircraft that drew green grids across the air. Light rained down into the canopy and bounced back with a story's LiDAR. Entire landscapes stood up from the screen causeways like white cords unrolled between cities. Terraces stepping hills in long corrals for water and soil. Moats and walls where scholars had assumed only brush. The numbers startled even those who had expected to be startled. Tens of thousands of structures riding the folds of the land, proving that what the eye takes as jungle is, in places, a garden let go. You could see, at a glance, how a capital gathered people to it, how outlying hamlets fed those gatherings, how ridges caught rain and sent it toward reservoirs squared off with stone. The ghosts of roads, the Sac-Biob, showed purpose and conversation, a city calling to its satellite and to arrival at once, confident enough to pave ambition into the ground, below ground. Other archives waited in caves where trickles had written stone into columns a hair's breadth at a time. Chemists and geologists cut thin slices and read them like the rings of a tree. The ratio of oxygen in a layer told a story of a wet year, a dry year, a string of bad ones. Lake bottoms offered their own scripts, chalky deposits that meant water had burned out in heat. Smears of eroded soil marking when hillsides let go after trees came down. These records did not speak in metaphors. They graphed misfortune, set against dates on monuments. They turned a speculation into a timeline. The last flourish of a stelae in one place lined up eerily with a run of thirsty years. A spike in building here occurred in a lull that the lakes marked as merciful. Correlation is not fate, but pattern is a stern tutor. Even water kept surprises for the curious. At Tikal, engineers and archaeologists traced the veins of the great reservoirs, how they caught, carried, and stored the sky, and found that the city had layered technology into devotion. Sand and crushed rock filtered the inflow in one basin. Volcanic zeolite and quartz hauled long distances. Did the slow magic of cleaning? In another, a red poison cinnabar pigment ground fine to make royal tombs glow had leached into mud and turned a pond into a quiet danger. The solutions and the mistakes lay inches apart in the silt ingenuity. And it's a shadow. The gods returned, not as objects of belief, but as characters you could overhear. The maize lord sprouted and was torn and sprouted again. His journey, teaching how to die and rise, how to plant and harvest. The hero twins foxed the lords of death with wit and ball game skill. A flayed deity grinned wisdom through pain. A Venus aspect brought war at dawn. The texts did not demote them to fable. They set them at the table alongside kings and queens, where metaphor and policy pass plates. On painted cups, scribes signed their names so-and-so. The painter and used wordplay flick like earrings, a god and a king sharing a title, a pun that only the initiated would hear. It was not a hazy mysticism, it was theater, law, and art. Braided, the decipherment also rearranged the collapse once. The end had been an empty stage, actors vanish. Curtain falls, now. You could hear the rustle backstage before the silence. Captives were paraded long after the date when chroniclers previously drew a line. New kings tried old claims. Outlying lords wrote their little year counts while capitals leaned. The end was not a single gasp, but a series of last breaths taken in different rooms at different hours. That nuance did not sweeten the story, but it made it human, most of all. Reading loosened the grip of two sentimental errors. The first said the Maya were peaceful star priests fooled by their own calendars. The second said they were doomed engineers who built themselves a trap. The texts insist on people instead clever, pious, petty, brave, frightened, ambitious, tender with their dead, ruthless with enemies, capable of policy and poetry in the same afternoon. They did not worship time, they used it. They did not march mindlessly toward disaster. They made hard choices in conditions that would have tested any polity on earth and paid the price when the sky withheld the one currency no ruler can mint. In museums and books, we keep the glamorous fragments. In villages and fields, the continuity remains, not as exhibit, but as habit. Modern readers, blessed with sound values and translations, can now hear what a lord in Copán meant to boast, what a mid-rank official in Palenque wanted remembered about his grandmother's weaving, what a scribe at Calakmul thought of his rival down the road. We can also watch as modern Maya scholars read their own history out loud in classrooms. The glyphs, no longer exotic, but ancestral. When a daykeeper runs a finger down a column of signs on a wall and smiles because the date fits the day, the distance between ancient and now collapses to the width of a fingertip. The forests still hold rooms no one has opened properly yet. LiDAR maps suggest volumes. A machete and a respectful team confirm details. A potsherd with a painted curl of a glyph peeks from dirt and asks to be read by eyes that have learned to expect meaning. If you sit quietly on a temple's steps toward evening, bats will strafe insects overhead like black commas, and the jungle will start its night paragraph. And below the chatter, you might hear a low murmur, part wind, part memory. Once, a king has stood here and announced a victory. Once, a mason wiped a sweat with a wrist and set another block. Once, a scribe dotted a sign with care so that we, later, could know the name of a person who stood up in time and spoke. The stones are not silent. We had to relearn how to listen. What, then, does a silence in stone say to a noisy century first? That brilliance can be brittle. The classic cities were machines for turning a sky into schedule and a schedule into certainty. For a long, generous spell, the rain obeyed. Fields rose and fell in green waves. Kings kept their bargains with the people and the gods. But a civilization balanced on punctual seasons and the applause for ritual needs margins unused reservoirs, spare timber, patience and policy. When the weather turned capricious, when forests thinned and hills bled their soil, the system had too few cushions and too many promises. That is the sobering echo. Greatness is not a shield against limits. Sophistication is not the same as a slack. Yet right beside that warning sits another truth, warmer and stubborn. The Maya did not vanish. The southern capitals emptied, yes. But the people did what people do when palaces fail. They changed scale. Villages tightened their circles. Families sought new patches where the corn might still take. Skills moved from courtly workshops to household patios, from scripts on a stone to memories poured into stories, song, and weaving. In the north and along the coasts, cities learned different habits, trade by canoe, alliances that smelled of salt, gods in feathered serpent guise presiding over markets as much as over battles. Resilience is less dramatic than collapse. It looks like bread baked tomorrow with less than you had today. That, too, is an inheritance. The lesson is not a sermon about destiny. It is a nudge about design, systems with many small parts, redundant reservoirs, fields planted in varied soils, councils that can bend without breaking, survive lurches better than systems that glitter with one grand answer. The classic world was good at precision. Its weakness was resilience. The records etched in limestone love exactness, and that exactness, ironically, became a trap when the sky ceased to be exact. A calendar can be perfect and still be wrong about next year's rain. The comfort of beautiful numbers is not the same as the comfort of extra grain. If there's a parable here for our own appetite, it lies in edges and thresholds. The Maya lived on a literal one between sea and upland, between dry season and storm, between thin soils and thick ambition. Cities on edges are inventive because they must be. They also tire the land faster if they forget how long it takes a tree to grow or a terrace to mend. The classic kings built encores for themselves, more stucco, more steps, more weight against the clouds until the applause was all that mattered. The night scholar with a candle and a ledger might have asked a simpler question. How many trunks did it take for that shine? And what will our grandchildren burn? But the past is generous even when it warns. In the ruins and the pollen and the lake beds, you can see better choices snap into view. Agroforestry that tucks maize among trees instead of replacing them, terraces that give soil a place to rest, reservoirs that not only store but filter, layer upon layer, so water stays sweet when months run long and the sky sulks. Beyond the fields, a different sort of prudence counsels that admit uncertainty, leaders who promise less spectacle and more margin. The kings of stone could not do that. Their power sat in a costume stitched from certainty. Ours, if we are wise, will learn to keep some seams loose. There's also a softer counsel, one it is easy to miss when the graphs and dates fill the mind. The classic cities believed the world was legible, that time could be braided into meaning, that ritual could escort a community across danger. The deciphered texts reveal a strategy and a spite and boast, yes, but they also reveal care for ancestors, for order, for the exact day on which to name a child, so fate and family rhyme. We may not share the old metaphysics, but the impulse to knit meaning and season together is not foolish. It is human. In the hardest years, ceremonies did not stop. People still gathered at thresholds, lit coals, murmured old words to remind themselves of who they were. That, too, is resilience. Beware. Then, the neat tale with one culprit and a single moral. Drought struck, forests fell, wars spun, rulers failed, each thread tugging the others until the whole cloth warped. The peaceable astronomer myth does not survive the blood-streaked murals. The eco-fable of blind overreach does not survive the ingenuity of filters hauled from far quarries or the long-run care in terraces and canals. Complexity is not an alibi. It is an instruction. Fix one thing and you may loosen another. Starve one vice and you may feed a different weakness. The historian's humility is a useful modern virtue. So is listening forward. Climate now, as then, is not a constant. Skies gather their own counsels. Seas remember old cold. Forests keep score. We read instruments that can catch a whisper in air pressure to 6 decimals and map drought months before they arrive. The Maya read Venus and counted the intervals between eclipses. Both are attempts to make tomorrow a little less surprising. Our cleverness will be judged, as theirs was, by what we do with the warning, not by how beautiful the prediction looks on paper. And then there's the matter of the story, the one we tell about endings. Collapse is a hard word. It lands with drama and sells books. But the archaeology insists on endings that are really scatterings, pauses, translations. The last dated stela does not mean the last lullaby. Languages endured, multiplying like seeds in a dry year. Textiles carried patterns across centuries the way a river carries light, zigzags that remember lightning, diamonds that remember maize, a cosmology threaded into cloth, so a child can wear a calendar on her shoulders without ever seeing a stone glyph. In kitchens, rituals for the hearth. In fields, the old milpa cycle repeating when rainfall permits maize, beans, squash. A choreography of roots and leaves that feeds soil as it feeds people. Survival prefers the low places, house altars, courtyard songs, the shade of a kiba where elders mix new advice with old weather. If you return to a site at dusk after the tourists have gone, the lesson grows quiet and sharp. A stairway climbs nowhere in particular. Vines have stitched shadows to the stone. A leaf-cutter ant carries its green flag past a carved date that still keeps count of a day no one remembers to celebrate. You can almost hear the debate that once filled this platform: build or wait, fight or trade. Plant here or there, you can almost hear the breath held in a courtyard while a priest drew blood and the crowd watched the smoke for a sign the rain would answer. And then you can hear, if you choose, the smaller sounds that outlasted both debate and drama, someone grinding corn at dawn, someone braiding a child's hair, someone teaching a name in a language that never accepted the idea of lost. So perhaps the gentlest guidance from these sleeping cities is this: aim your brilliance at buffers as well as at marvels. Cherish the unspectacular habit that keeps tomorrow fed. Leave room in your plans for a year that refuses to behave. Love your numbers, but keep your hands in the dirt. You will not control the sky. You might, with care. Be ready for its moods. The rest is gratitude. To the masons who set the stones straight, to the scribes who dotted the heads of gods so we could pronounce them again, to the farmers who kept faith with seeds when kings could not keep faith with their promises, to the descendants who carry languages, recipes, prayers, and the stubborn courtesy of endurance. The cities fell silent, the people did not. The lesson is not despair, it is attention. And so, here at the end of our quiet walk, the jungle breathes again. The cities have told us what they can. A stone remembers triumph and panic with equal patience. Poland remembers what the eye forgets. Lake mud and cave rock keep calendars that no king can amend. We began with a mystery whispered under leaves and ended with a chorus of small, confirmable truths, war sharpened beyond ritual, forests thinned to feed white temples, skies withholding their promise. The unraveling was not a single snap, but many threads tugged at once until the fabric lost its shape. But if the classic capitals became ruins, their meanings did not. The echoed heart of this story is not disappearance, it is continuity. In the markets of highland towns, a vendor counts change in one of 36 Mayan languages, vowels soft as water over a stone. In villages where night still belongs to stars, a girl learns the old milpa rhythm maize, beans, squash without ever calling it sustainable agriculture. A weaver coaxes constellations from thread, patterns that remember myths in the geometry of diamonds and the steps. In churchyards where saints and ancestors shared the calendar, candles flicker in front of crosses dressed with palm and pine. The classic world's monuments went quiet. The people's voices did not. Scholars, too, found ways to listen. For a century, the glyphs seemed to smile and refuse us. Then a handful of stubborn minds showed that names and deeds were there all along, syllables nested in art. Now a reader can follow a king's life from birth to accession, to the day his stone records his last rising sun. New tools widened our sight again, from planes and satellites, pulses of light. LiDAR shaved the forest from the map and revealed causeways like stitched seams, suburbs where households once clustered, networks of fields and canals that turned city into something wider and more organic. The classic world was less a handful of royal hilltops than an interlocked quilt of neighborhoods, scale, coordination, fragility, all easier to see when canopy becomes plan. In that widened view, certainty grows humbler. The same evidence that explains also complicates. Warfare was frequent and sometimes ferocious, and yet diplomacy stitched temporary peace as often as spears tore it. Forests were felled at a shocking pace to feed kilns, yet pockets of managed woodland persisted. groves tended for medicine, fruit, and timber in a kind of mosaic that modern foresters recognize. The droughts were real and punishing, yet adaptation flared where coast and canoe, cenote and terrace allowed a different bargain with water. Collapse and resilience are not opposites here. They are neighbors on the same street. Perhaps the deepest lesson is about promises. Classic kings bound themselves to the sky I cut. You reign for centuries. That vow held often enough to look like law. When the pattern failed, the office failed because it was built to dazzle rather than to flex. The opposite posture, less splendor. More slack is less satisfying to watch, but better to live under when the wind shifts. The people who left the plazas did not abandon meaning, they abandoned an institution that had outlived its conditions. In their smaller circles, they kept rights that fit the weather, the field, the household. That is not defeat. It is adult wisdom. You can feel this wisdom even in the ruins if you let the day empty out around you. The greatest stairways still ask for the old processions, but what lingers is quieter, the worn lip of a grinding a stone, the soot stain above an old hearth, a broken figurine buried under a threshold as a blessing to a new room. Archaeology keeps finding these small anchors and setting them back into our idea of the past. The grand narratives need them. A century of digging has taught us to love patterns and curves, rise and fall, boom and bust. But the life that flows through those shapes is domestic and durable work. Kin, ceremony, stubborn humor on a lean day. It is the dailiness that survives systems. If there is a mirror here for our own world, it is polished enough to be useful and cloudy enough to keep us modest. We too have become expert at prediction, dazzling in our charts, as proud of our instruments as the classic astronomer was of his Venus tables. We too build long supply chains that turn weather into schedules and the schedules into confidence. And we too live on edges of climate, of soil, of patience. The Maya remind us that precision can outpace prudence, that complexity without buffers grows gorgeous and then brittle. They also remind us this is the gift we should not refuse, that culture survive shocks best when memory is spread out in many languages, in many crafts, in many small institutions that do not all fail at once. Across the peninsula, the present still speaks to the past with a certain courtesy. A child runs shouting through a ball court where voices once rose for omens. A farmer checks clouds over a low ridge and hears, without drama, a forecast in the way swallows curl. An elder jokes that the saints prefer copal smoke to candles and proves it by lighting both. In the museums, the Bastone kings blink under glass while visitors read their names aloud, getting the vowels right for the first time in 1,000 years. Out at night, under the same planets, a tourist points and calls one bright wanderer the evening star, and a guide nods and says yes, and tells, if asked, that old scribes tracked it so carefully that war and peace took their cue from its absence and return. We began with the noise of machetes cutting through jungle to a plaza no one expected to find. We end with a different kind of silence, the kind you can sleep in. History for sleep does not mean history dulled. It means a story paced for the body at rest, big enough to hold frailty without panic and endurance without trumpet. The classic Maya gave us both. Their fall is not a curse. It is a caution written in polite letters. Their survival is not a miracle. It is human beings being competent at staying human. If you visit one day, go early or late. Listen for the first birds and the last. Touch the stone lightly, it warms fast. Read the dates if you like, count backwards from a creation. They said in myth to the day a king raised his astilla and made his boast. Then sit where the plaza opens to the sky and do a simpler math, a breath in, a breath out, all the uncounted breaths between their time and ours. Let the lesson be plain. Keep your systems generous. Keep your meanings portable. Keep your promises modest and your margins large. When the sky changes, move with it. When the corn fails here, plant there. When the calendar insists, smile and wait for weather. The silent cities are not asking for pity. They are offering perspective. Take it lightly, like a traveler who knows that dawn roads have a fewer ruts. Tonight, as the last notes fade and your room grows cool, let their long story lay its hand on your shoulder, brilliant, brittle, adaptive, enduring, stone, seed, star, and song. The jungle will keep breathing, the past will keep being useful, and you eyes closed now, breath steady, will keep a little of this with you into sleep, not an answer, but a way to listen.